Chapter 1. The Wheel Turns and Ages Come to Pass. Chapter text Chapter 1. The wheel turns and ages come to pass. She'd been fighting for what felt like hours. The forces of the light still held the small town behind her, at least in part, but they'd been pushed back from the trench lines. Wave after wave of Trollocs, Myrddraal and simple Darkfriends thrown forward until the defenders were forced to retreat or die. She'd stayed behind, working her way from trenches to craters to half-ruined walls, staying under cover and disrupting the Shadows' advance as much as she could. She'd already killed 3 of their channelers, scum who'd gotten overconfident, not even realizing she was there before she incinerated them where they stood. Now she was quietly working her way towards a group of Trollocs, led by a lone Myrddraal as they picked their way through the detritus of battle towards the light's empty trenches. She just needed to get a little closer. Her instincts screamed a warning, and she snapped her head to the right, already spinning a web of air to throw a barrier between her and the towering wall of fire that was descending upon her. It exploded with a roar, breaking harmlessly against her barrier even as she channeled. Spirit, fire, a hint of earth and air came together in a fraction of a second, split 4 ways. Streaks of fire swung wide from her, tearing through the air to obliterate swathes of ground amidst the Shadows' lines. She didn't wait to see whether she'd hit her target. She could feel the strain as she spun, and the moment her webs came together, she was already running. She dived into the abandoned trenches, sacrificing any attempt at stealth. She'd been fighting for hours and knew she was on her last legs, but staying still meant death. She wasn't sure anything other than death was in her near future, but light damn her, she'd make them fight for it. She hadn't really expected to hit the enemy channeler, but she was still disappointed when the trench behind her exploded only moments after she'd fled through it. They were strong, too strong at this point. She couldn't feel their spinning, whether it was a man or a woman inverting her webs, but whoever they were, they had the advantage over her. Were those footsteps running behind her? She paused, channeled. Flows of spirit, air and fire came together and lightning struck from the clouded sky, obliterating the trenches she'd just run through. Fire came blazing back down towards her, the enemy's own lightning descended from above. She sliced the webs with razor-sharp spirit and fire. It was a strain. They were too strong. Could this be one of the Forsaken? She needed to keep running. She wanted to travel, but the wards covering the trenches wouldn't allow it. As she ran, panting for breath, she left a few small traps for them. Small, inverted webs that would explode in fire or razor-sharp air. She knew she needed to get back to the town hall. The defense was being coordinated from there, and she might be able to get help or find some way to escape. No one had thought that the Shadow would field a powerful channeler here, and the forces of the light hadn't been ready to deal with it. She'd made a promise last night. She needed to run if she was going to keep it. She nearly ran into a small pack of Trollocs. A thought, and they died in fire. She was almost there. Light only knew how many Trollocs she'd killed today, but the whole line was collapsing. Reinforcements were needed here. Over the crack of sharklances and the bestial howl of Trollocs, she heard the first of her traps detonate and a roar of rage. A man, then. He seemed to be losing ground. She didn't expect any of the traps to stop him, but at least they'd slow him down. Pausing in her flight for just a second, she pulled the last grenade from her belt and thrust it into the side of the trench with a quick web of spirit, air and water to hide it, and a spun trigger to set it off when someone walked by. Perhaps a conventional trap would be more effective. There was no time to wait and find out, and soon she was staggering into the battered town hall, past the armored troops firing their sharklances from behind the cover of the walls. Taija Sedai. An officer shouted when he saw her. She cut him off, gasping out. Channeler, too strong, going for help. Try to delay him. She didn't see the look of grim determination come onto his face and barely heard the barked orders as she staggered past him, heading for the basement. The thick stone walls of the town hall muffled the sounds of the battle above when she stumbled into its basement. She was almost too tired to feel relief when she saw her friend Entiro, a huge bearded man poring over a map, occasionally barking orders into a radio, while the local administrators frantically filled a large stasis box for evacuation from the oncoming forces of the Shadow. Antiro looked up as she came in, concern drawing lines across his face. "Taija, what's happened? You're injured." She reached up to her face and was surprised to find she was bleeding. It's nothing. We need to move now. We're about to be overrun, and there's a heavy hitter out there, maybe even one of the Forsaken. I've done my best to slow him down, but I can't handle him, not now. We need to get reinforcements. The look on his face told her straight away there was no help coming, or evacuate. She faltered, exhaustion warring with her grasp on Sedai. Finding herself struggling to stand now that her life wasn't in immediate danger, she leant on the side of the stasis box, ignoring an irritated look from one of the bureaucrats. Is the basement still outside the wards? Yes, but she interrupted him, ignoring the reluctance that flared up inside her at what she was about to propose. I'm not sure I can make a gateway right now. Link with me. She knew Antiro wasn't strong enough to make a gateway by himself. He had other talents than the power, but combined they should still have enough strength for a gateway to get as many people as they could out before they were overrun. Antiro opened his mouth to reply when the whole building shook, making her stumble. That was Sedin. As he shouted, the building shook again, harder, plaster falling from the ceiling. She felt herself losing her balance, stumbling out of control. Explosions racked the town hall, throwing her around as the building shook itself apart above her. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Antiro reaching out to her, his mouth open in an unheard scream. Chapter 2, Life on the Farm. Chapter text, Chapter Roman 2, Life on the Farm. Alexei sighed as he trudged behind the two oxen, watching the plow they were dragging slowly draw furrows in the dirt. Not for the first time, he found himself daydreaming of adventure, perhaps saving a princess from Shadowspawn and being rewarded with money, land, and a life that went beyond his village. He was still young. He'd only inherited his farm a year ago when his father had died of a sudden fever. He still missed the man, could remember his smile, the calm, confident way he taught him everything he knew. His father would want him to stay and keep the family farm going, but that didn't change things. The idea of another 30 or 40 years behind a plow in Ramshorn made him shudder. Still, if he wanted to eat this winter, the field needed plowing. He just wished anything would happen to break up the monotony of his work. He was so caught up in his reverie that he nearly fell over the plow when it came to a grinding halt, its blades caught on something in the soil. Flaming rocks, Alexei muttered to himself as he stepped closer to examine whatever it was that had stopped the plow's progress. Hopefully it wasn't too big a stone, or it would be even more of a pain to dig out of the soil. What he hadn't expected was to see something artificial poking out of the ground, an unnaturally straight, if grime-covered, corner of something larger. It had no give to it at all when he pushed at it with his foot, so he bent down for a closer look, trying to push away some of the mud. When he brushed his hand over the object, his skin tingled, and the dirt seemed to almost fall off like it didn't want to stick to whatever it was, exposing dull, grey metal, unblemished by the plow's impact. He glanced back at the plow with a muttered curse. Was that a dent in one of the blades? After a moment, he looked back at the object, a flutter of excitement in his belly. Maybe this was the adventure he'd been looking for, a chest of riches buried in his field, or even a mysterious relic from the Age of Legends. He knew it was a silly fantasy, but still, this wasn't normal, and he'd have to get it out of the field either way, unless he wanted to leave a chunk of his land unplanted. After a moment's thought, Alexei carefully started backing up the oxen before steering them and the plow around and away from the mysterious metal corner. He'd come back later, but for now the farm had its demands. That evening, he returned with a spade to work under the spring evening sun. An hour's digging exposed more of whatever it was. He suspected it was probably a box or chest of some sort, but also that it was huge, at least 3 paces to a side. It wasn't going to be easy to unearth it, but his curiosity had been fired up. He could hardly spend his life complaining to himself about how boring things were and then ignore something as interesting as this. He'd need more time to dig it out properly, and then he could decide what to do. The real question was whether he should tell someone else about it, but in the end it was much more exciting for it to be his secret, at least until he worked out what the thing actually was. It wasn't like anyone else ever came to this bloody field anyway. It took a few more days of digging, in between sessions behind the plow, but eventually Alexei got enough of his new treasure uncovered to have a better idea of what it was. The back half still lay buried in the dirt, but it was clearly a box of some kind, made of a dull grey metal, perhaps 3 paces across, and seemingly completely unmarked by its time in the ground, other than by dirt, which didn't really stick to it anyway. He'd heard stories about other people who'd unearthed strange things. Some had been cursed by them, others had been able to sell them, not even for silver but for actual gold. He'd never heard of something like this, though. A solid box, no seams, no markings, just sitting there. It was at the same time the strangest, and yet most deeply mundane thing he'd ever seen. At first, he tried brushing the dirt off it with his hands, but that had been unpleasant. His skin always seemed to feel strange when he touched it, an odd tingling sensation running through it, but there was nothing else interesting about it. Not a thing. Eventually, he'd even brought a broom with him to brush the dirt off the exposed parts. This revealed nothing other than more dull, grey metal. He gave it an experimental prod with his foot, and as ever, nothing happened. A harder prod yielded the same, frustrating, results for his long hours of work. Mother's milk in a cup. He gave it a hard kick before hopping away yelping from the pain in his foot. Still cursing to himself, Alexei was distracted from the pain by the feel of the rising on the nape of his neck and goosebumps shooting up his skin. Something had changed. At first, there was just a low humming noise, like a distant beehive, seeming to come from the box. Then the sound started to rise in both pitch and volume, quickly turning into an almost painfully loud whine. Alexei froze, his hurt foot forgotten, staring wide-eyed at the box as red lights started to flash rhythmically in each exposed corner. This must be witchcraft, the one power. He staggered back, falling over as he tried to get away from it. Why was the box shaking? Was it about to explode? Alexei realized he wasn't as ready for adventure as he'd thought when he found himself crawling backwards in terror, unable to take his eyes off the now violently shaking artifact. A woman's voice rang out, clearly enunciating nonsense words that still sounded smooth and elegant. Danger. Catastrophic system failure detected. Initiating emergency shutdown. Please clear the area. The noise from the artifact reached a crescendo and then suddenly stopped, the lights going out. A second later, there was a loud hiss of escaping steam. The front of the box swung open, its movement completely unimpeded by soil still surrounding its bottom half. Alexei had to shield his eyes for a moment as blazingly bright light shone forth from inside. A moment later it was gone, and he was left lying in the dirt, staring into it with wide, fearful eyes. As his vision recovered, he saw a woman silhouetted in its entrance, surrounded by disorganized piles of paper. She was wearing strange clothes colored in patches of green and brown, but covered in dirt. No skirts, though, a man's trousers and boots. Her dark skin seemed to suggest she might be Terrabona, but he wasn't sure. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and it looked like it might be matted with blood. He was fairly sure there was blood on her face. She looked young, only a few years older than he was, and he was already starting to smell something burnt now that the box had opened. Even as Alexei gaped at the sight from his position in the mud, she reached out in front of her, staring forward with unseeing eyes, screaming something incoherent. She took a couple of steps forward, and then collapsed into a heap face first in the dirt. All he wanted to do was run. He had no idea what was going on, but this must be something to do with the one power. There was no way that woman could have survived for as long as that thing must have been buried. But no, he'd wanted to be a hero, and he couldn't just run away at the first frightening thing he saw. Instead, with an effort of will, he forced himself to stand up and move towards the woman. He didn't know what was going on, but he couldn't just leave her like this. Chapter 3. Village Life is Not for Taija. Chapter text, Chapter Roman 3. Village life is not for Taija. Why did the world feel like it was spinning around her? Everything hurt, from the soles of her feet right to the top of her head, but it was her head that hurt more than anything, a piercing agony ripping through it. She slowly opened her eyes, but didn't try to move. She wasn't not sure she could. Where was she? Actually, what day was it? She wasn't sure. Why did it feel like she was lying in cold mud? She wouldn't do that, would she? She blinked against the too bright sunlight as she looked up. Wasn't she underground? She wasn't really sure, but that sounded right. A young man loomed over her, and with an effort she forced her bleary eyes to focus on him. Did she know him? He reminded her a little bit of a young Antiro. What a silly thought. A giggle came out, sounding more like a groan. Why did he look terrified? The man was sweating, which didn't make much sense. She was practically shivering. Had he been running? His clothes don't make any sense either. Some kind of rough tunic and trousers in drab colors. It reminded her of when she'd visited the Amali historic village before the war. It had been full of actors dressed just like him, showing tourists about life in a past age. Her brain was refusing to focus on working out where she was. In fact, she couldn't think about much at all through the head-splitting pain. She vaguely thought the village would be full of Trollocs now, though. Hadn't the shadow taken? Couldn't quite remember. She wanted to giggle groan at the idea of Trollocs in historic costumes, but some part of her told her that that was not at all funny, and her ribs hurt too much anyway. The man stammered something incomprehensible at her. Jun Wef QKKJ CWE KMKW. She wasn't sure if she couldn't understand because he was speaking nonsense or if it was because her own brain simply wasn't working. Either way, now seemed to be a good time to pass out. She didn't know how long it was before she woke again, but the next time she found herself in some kind of bed. She wasn't sure where she was, but it was definitely not a medical facility. The walls were made of wood, and a glassless window let daylight filter in. Everything looked rustic would be the nicest way to put it. She faded in and out of consciousness over the next few days, fever dreams sending her mind on spiraling journeys of delirium. In rare moments of what she hoped was lucidity, she remembered seeing the man from when she passed out looking worried and wiping her brow with a damp cloth. Once or twice, there was an elderly lady, too. She'd spooned foul-tasting concoctions down her throat. She liked the man better, assuming either of them was even real. Eventually, though Taija's periods of lucidity grew longer, and she gradually regained her awareness of her surroundings. She was able to stay awake longer, and her exhausted mind could start to work on finding out where she was, what happened to her. The next time the young man returned, coincidentally accompanied by the elderly lady that time, they both seemed excited to see she was awake, babbling incomprehensibly at her. Taija was able to croak out a few words of her own. "Where am I? What happened? Why are you dressed like that?" Light. She was clearly still not all there if she thought that question was important. The woman hesitated, obviously confused, and then replied, "Id DJJ WDFB WDKMFW EFHW NFW UNKN WECFMK." Taija could tell from the tone that the woman was asking questions. Her body language also said she was used to being obeyed. That didn't help either of them, though, as Taija had no idea what she was saying. Some of it sounded vaguely familiar, like it was on the edge of comprehension, but Taija just couldn't grasp it. Could she have suffered a brain injury? Should she be questioning everything she perceived now? No, she was sure there was a rational explanation for her situation. There were communities out there that rejected modern technology and isolated themselves from the world. She must have ended up in one somehow. A traveling accident. A gateway that brushed against the wrong kind of ward. It still didn't make sense, though. The two strangers were having a worried-sounding conversation over her in their strange language, and Taija was getting more and more agitated, although she was too weak to actually do anything. Even in isolated communities where they exclusively spoke their own dialects, they would still recognize the common tongue. They'd have called for help, or have taken her to a hospital. Taija's still blurred vision took in the decrepit wooden walls of the shack they seemed to have put her in. This was more like some kind of role-playing group that wouldn't break character, which made absolutely no sense. Taija tried to reach up, to get their attention. "Please, I am an Aes Sedai. If you can just contact." She trailed off, her energy fleeing her. They seemed to react to the words Aes Sedai, but she was still met by the same incomprehension. As she got more frantic in her attempts to speak, the woman whispered soothing words and pushed a cup to her lips. Before Taija knew what she was doing, she was drinking the strange tea. Yes, it must be tea that the woman was pouring into her mouth. It didn't take long for sleep to claim her once again, despite the increasingly tense conversation going on over her head. It took a while for lucidity to properly return to Taija, but over the next few weeks she slowly recovered and started trying to work out where she was and what had happened to her. It was pretty obvious that something must have gone badly wrong, although what it was she still wasn't sure. As for where she was completely flummoxed. Nothing seemed to make sense, not even Taija's most outlandish theories about where she could have ended up properly fit what she was seeing. Taija also knew she was definitely not feeling like herself. She thought she might have had a bad concussion, and she felt weak as a kitten. Worse, the first time she tried to embrace the power, a couple of weeks after she first woke up, the pain spearing through her head had been so bad that she'd been left lying in bed with silent tears of pain and frustration streaming down her cheeks. However, Taija's very nature rebelled against staying in bed, especially when she was in such a strange situation. She desperately wanted to push herself to get out and at least regain some sense of control over her circumstances. She knew she needed the rest, though. The elderly lady who'd been helping the young man look after her also made sure that Taija stayed in bed. She might be some kind of crazy homesteader, but she was still formidable. Normally, Taija wouldn't put up with it, but in her current state, there wasn't much she could do against the woman's flinty gaze. Given that she was stuck in bed anyway, she did all that she could to improve her situation. The first step was to turn the young man and older woman's babbling into something more comprehensible. Taija had spent the last 5 years of her life fighting a desperate war for the survival of her very civilization, but she was no intellectual slouch before that. So she turned her intellect towards learning the language that those people spoke. It wasn't physics, but it was still an intellectual problem. It was humiliating having to communicate through pointing and making basic sounds, but needs must. Taija quickly realized that the language they were speaking seemed to be related to the common tongue. It also seemed to be simpler, which was helpful, although she did realize that the simplicity might simply be because her hosts were talking down to her. It didn't take her long to learn that the owner of the rustic building she was in and her rescuer was called Alexei. The stern, elderly woman was Elena. She seemed to be some kind of a healer. Certainly she was no doctor or nurse, but she had many of their attitudes and was very determined to dispense various herbs to Taija. Taija also noticed that she both expected and received a lot of deference from Alexei. He seemed to refer to her by a title of some kind, although Taija struggled to work out what it meant. Still, she made sure to be as respectful as possible to her too. Not that she'd be disrespectful to Alexei or anyone else. He'd looked after her, despite apparently living in crushing poverty, and regardless, she was pretty much at his mercy. Given the weirdness of these people, she preferred not to think about that. Once she was awake, but still immobile, Taija received a few more visitors. Apparently she was somewhere named Ramshorn, which meant absolutely nothing to her. Elena supervised those visits, and as far as Taija could tell, it was just curious rubber-necking. No one spoke the common tongue, and they all wore the same rough, drab clothes. Could it be some kind of strange cult? More pleasant were the visits she started to get from the young children of the village. At first they weren't left alone with her, Elena sternly watching them, but when she didn't seem to mind, and presumably because she didn't seem very dangerous, it wasn't long before they were coming alone. It was nice having happy, innocent kids playing around. The contrast to the days of the war was stark. It was also actually very good for Taija's language skills. The children thought her difficulties in making herself understood were hilarious, but explaining things to her seemed to quickly become a sort of game for them, and her progress with their language moved forward in leaps and bounds. By the time Taija felt able to get out of bed and totter short distances, she'd learnt enough of the language to communicate on a basic level. She wasn't going to be discussing abstract concepts for a while, but at least she could function. As Elena walked through Ramshorn, returning the respectful nods from the people she passed, her mind turned to the village's newest arrival. It was good to see the woman Alexei had found back on her feet. She'd been worried that young Taija would die when Alexei first came running to her, but the girl was strong, and she'd pulled through. Alexei's refusal to elaborate on where he'd found her was more than irritating, but the man had always been stubborn. If she hadn't known better, Elena would have thought the young woman had been thoroughly beaten, but there was no one within leagues of Ramshorn who would do such a thing to her, and it didn't explain her illness, nor her perplexing lack of knowledge of the common tongue. Elena could admit she wasn't the most worldly woman, but she had once traveled as far as Kimlin, and she had never met anyone who couldn't speak the common tongue. Oh well, she shrugged to herself with a wry smile. Taija was harmless, and Alexei certainly seemed taken with her. Like so many young men, Alexei dreams of nobly rescuing maidens in distress, and it seemed like he'd actually found one, light knows where. She'd find that out eventually, of course, Sooner or later he'd crack. Still, this Taija seemed like a sweet enough woman. She might be a year or two older than Alexei, but the village could do with new blood. Once Taija was moving again, she insisted on helping Alexei with his farm, doing what light tasks her gradual recovery allowed. At the same time, she started working harder on finding out where she was and what happened. When she was able to walk around Alexei's village, indeed called Ramshorn, it only fed the growing anxiety she was feeling in her belly. This wasn't some kind of cult or weird role-play situation. It was just too convincing and too odd. No one spoke the common tongue. There was no hint at all of modern technology, no modern fabrics, no nothing. Even more perplexing, there were no contrails from show wings in the air. Even with the reduction in civil aviation because of the war, there were few places in the world where she would never see anything in the sky. Taija even stayed up one clear night staring into the sky, hoping to see the familiar sight of one of the four great stations as they orbited the planet. There was nothing, though. At least the constellations still seemed familiar, glittering brightly in a night sky unmarred by light pollution. While Taija was indulging her curiosity, Alexei and Alina were clearly extremely curious about her too. However, she was more than a little reticent in how much she said to them. There was simply too much she didn't know, and while they'd been nothing but kind, well-learned paranoia made her careful. Alexei seemed rather shy, and occasionally even a bit scared of Taija. Alina, on the other hand, had no issues with questioning her. In a way, it was lucky that she was struggling so much to communicate. Her awkward, almost childlike conversations made it much easier to be vague with her answers. Neither of them had ever heard of Taija's home city, Adanza, or any of the other great cities, in fact. It was hard to believe anybody in the world wouldn't have heard of them. However, isolated they were. She did, however, manage to establish that Ramshorn was in Andor. That would have been much more helpful to her if she had any idea where Andor was. A lot of back and forth let her establish that its biggest city was named Keemlin, and there was a single ruler there. She thought a queen, but maybe a president. It was definitely a woman based on the grammatical forms. There were apparently other big cities, but they didn't seem to know much more than names. More careful interrogation told Taija that Keemlin was maybe 3 weeks' travel away. Obviously, they couldn't be talking about travel by car. Taija could easily cross a continent in 3 weeks that way. However, even on foot, that would still be hundreds of kilometers. Taija's worries only grew with that realization. There was no way she could possibly not have heard about a community like this that covered such a large area. It didn't make any sense. Her frustration was added to by her lack of vocabulary. It was driving her up the wall, and however fast she learnt their language, she still felt her grasp of it was deeply inadequate. Another couple of weeks found her feeling almost back to normal. Taija wasn't back in the fighting shape that she wanted to be in, but she was finally feeling more like herself. She'd also managed to get herself to the level where she could say she had a working knowledge of their language. Ironically, they also seemed to call it the common tongue, which was a ridiculous conceit for their backwards community. Taija couldn't say she was completely fluent in the language, but at least she could understand most things the villagers were saying. She was hugely grateful for the way the villagers had accepted her into their village. They'd been nothing but kind to her, although she'd had to bite your tongue a few times when Alina had called her girl and ordered her around. Taija was fairly sure Alina was well under half her age. However, they didn't seem to know she was an Aes Sedai. In fact, she wasn't totally sure they even know anything about Aes Sedai at all. Either way, while Taija felt they'd earned some measure of trust with their treatment of her, she thought that, given how little she really knew about them, some things were best kept hidden. She hadn't tried to ask about the war or the One Power. She didn't know how they'd react, and her ability as a channeler was a huge trump card to have in reserve if it turned out they were dark friends after all. Of course, it was easier to say that when she hadn't been able to channel without almost incapacitating herself from the pain. Without knowing what was wrong with her and a proper medical examination, Taija knew it was dangerous to try to channel. However, it was pretty clear that she wasn't going to be seeing a doctor anytime soon. She knew the addictive nature of Sedar as well as anyone, and it was been a growing struggle resisting the urge to just embrace it and hold it for a while, even with the risk of inadvertently burning herself out hovering over her. Eventually, Taija decided she couldn't hold herself back any longer. She reached out to the power, slowly, carefully going through basic visualization exercises that had been second nature to her for well over a century. Tentatively, she reached out to the glowing warmth of Sedar and embraced it, channeling just a trickle of it into a glowing ball of light. There was no pain. Everything was just as it should be. She shivered happily, luxuriating in the wonderful feel of Sedar within her and draw more of the power. More and more she pulled, drawing in a deep, deep river of Sedar's sweetness, just holding it in herself until she started to feel the warning pinpricks that told her she was at the limit of what she could safely channel. After another moment, Taija released the power with a soft sigh. A hole in her spirit that she hadn't even realized was there now healed. A second later, she was kicking herself for her idiocy. These people might not know anything about the one power, but any woman or Myrddraal within kilometers of her might have sensed that display, like a lighthouse spearing through the night. Thankfully, no one seemed to have noticed Taija's channeling. Certainly, there was no reaction over the next couple of days. Reassured by that, she started to use Sedar a bit more to make her life easier. Even with all her experience and rigid discipline, it was hard to stop herself. She was a researcher, not a farmer, and while the years of war had hardened her, digging through fields or hauling water from a well was never going to be something she'd aspired to doing. Taija also started to become restless. Now that she was fully healed again, the smallness of the world she was living in started to chafe. She missed her books, writing, educated debates. Taija didn't miss the war at all, but her conscience was whispering away in the background. She'd done her best not to think about it, but she needed to know what was happened to her friends, her comrades. The shadow was out there, killing, torturing, reveling in its depravity, and she was sitting there using Sedar to plant seeds when no one was looking. Taija knew she'd been avoiding talking about the future, and so had Alexei, but her conscience won't let her keep doing it forever. So the next day she cornered him outside his house. "Alexei, I am always grateful for all that you have done for me." Her face was serious, and his normal cheerful smile slipped slightly. "But I cannot stay with your charity for all the times. I am better, fully healthy. I must know what happened to me, how I come to be here. I know you do not want to talk of it, but this is important." Taija knew she hadn't quite expressed herself the way she wanted, but she thought he understood. He definitely wasn't smiling after that, but he eventually nodded at her earnest expression. "Yes. You're right, I should have told you sooner," he smiled hopefully, "but I had wished we could avoid it. He seemed lost for words. "You've been a blessing coming into my life, and I had hoped we could forget about." Alexei sighed and then shrugged and continued. "But you have a right to know. I don't know how to explain, but I can just show you this evening. After the day's work, I'll take you." Taija was distracted for the whole day and struggled to focus on her work, menial labor holding even less appeal than before. When the evening finally arrived, Alexei was there as promised. It was a silent, awkward walk to a field that she hadn't realized he farmed. Looking at the neatly plowed furrows in the dimming light, Taija quickly saw there was something sticking out the dirt in the middle of the field. It looked like someone had dug around it. For a second she stood, just staring. Was that? Before she knew it, she found herself running towards it, a horrifying suspicion growing in her chest. She didn't need to get close before she could properly see what it was. The smooth, metallic shape of an open stasis box, sticking out of the ground it had been buried in. Taija slowed to a walk as she got closer. Why did she feel dizzy? Her legs were trembling, and the world seemed to spin around her until she paused, resting her hands on her thighs and breathing heavily. After a moment, she was able to master herself again and straighten up. A glance back showed her that Alexei was hanging back, looking worried. She almost felt like she could remember. As she got closer to the open box, saw the papers strewn inside it, the memories crashed back into her mind. She remembered. Desperate flight back to the town hall, the basement, and Tiro, channeling, crashing darkness. After a moment, Taija realized she'd sunk to her knees, tears running down her cheeks as she stared at it. She wasn't sure how long she knelt there, but eventually she was startled from her reverie by the feel of Alexei's hand on her shoulder. She was too out of sorts to even react to the unexpected touch. "Are you all right?" His voice was filled with concern. Taija didn't say anything. The stasis box looked inert, completely untouched, but she wasn't stupid enough to assume that meant anything. Quickly embracing Sedai, ignoring the way her mind whirled from the shark, she put together the lightest of diagnostic webs and let it flow over the box. Nothing. There were still drifts of paperwork in the stasis box, secret information that needed to be kept from the shadow, but nothing that would tell her anything about what went wrong. Shrugging off Alexi's hand, Taija stood up and tottered over to the stasis box on unsteady feet before putting a trembling hand onto it where the control screen was. Nothing happened. Tentatively, she sent a thread of spirit and fire into it. Still nothing. It was completely dead. Alexei was still a little distance away, watching her with concern when Taija turned back to him. "What happened?" she demanded, a bit more sharply than she meant to. He hesitated and then began to speak, words spilling out. It was like in the stories. I was plowing the field and I found this, so I dug it out. I didn't know what it was, I still don't, but I thought it was something ancient, perhaps it had treasure in it. When I tried to open it, there was some kind of witchcraft, Aes Sedai business. Her heart skipped a beat when he mentioned Aes Sedai. Alexei continued, oblivious to Taija's reaction. There were lights and a voice speaking in a strange language. He hesitated before continuing in a rush. "The same language you speak. I thought I disturbed some ancient curse, but then it opened and you came out. You were hurt and you just passed out right there. I grabbed you and brought you back to my house and called for the wisdom, and that's it. I haven't touched this bark since. I don't want to get entangled in Aes Sedai business." He made a gesture that she thought might be meant to ward off evil. Behind her impassive expression, Taija's mind was whirring desperately, trying to work out what could have happened. A stasis box was an incredibly complex piece of technology, something only a real specialist could really understand. She'd been holding the power, and Tiro was probably channeling Sedin, and there was the Dark Friend channeler coming after her, perhaps even one of the Forsaken. Maybe she channeled instinctively as the roof fell in. She wasn't sure, but there must have been some kind of power interaction with the stasis box. Taija wondered how long she was in there for, what kind of interaction there might have been with the very fabric of reality. These people, their language, their technology level, like something from the distant past of the dimly remembered First Age. The lack of standing flows, no mention of the war. She realized with growing dread that she might have been in that box for more than a few days, more than a few years even. She needed to find out what happened, to find her friends, her fiancé. How long could it have been? "Taija, are you all right?" she heard Alexei tentatively ask, and she realized she'd been standing there, blank-faced and lost in thought for far too long. "I am sorry," she quickly said. "I was just thinking." One thing was clear: she couldn't stay in Ramshorn. She was never suited for the village life, let alone their backwards version of it. She needed answers. When was she? What had happened over the last years, or was it centuries? It was obvious that those answers wouldn't be forthcoming in Ramshorn. As she walked back to Alexei's house, she started planning. Taija the Invalid was done, and Taija Kosola Murinen, I said I was back. As a first step, she was going to need to go somewhere with more information. This Keemlin was the only place that made sense. It seemed to be the closest real city, and maybe there would be answers there. Taija had no money, and her grasp of their language was still a little shaky, but she'd make do. If only she had a better idea of where she was trying to go, she could just travel there, but oh well. They always did say walking was good for the soul. Chapter 4. Thank the light for modern boots. Chapter text, Chapter Roman 4. Thank the light for modern boots. Once Taija had decided that she needed to go to Keemlin, there was no point wasting her time. Ramshorn had been good to her, but it was quickly becoming stifling. She'd avoided answering too many questions about where she came from simply by claiming amnesia, although she still hadn't worked out the exact word for that in their language, assuming it had won. Taking her cue from Alexei's obfuscation of where he found her and his clear fear of anything to do with the power, Taija certainly don't mention anything about the stasis box. Alexei had needed a bit more of an explanation, but at the same time, she wasn't going to reveal too much to him. He'd saved her life and had earned some trust and a lot of gratitude for that. However, he was also clearly uncomfortable with anything to do with the power and Aes Sedai, and she just didn't know how he'd react to the truth. So once Taija got him alone, she told him one more partial truth, still pretending that she didn't really know where she came from. "Alexei, I'll forever be grateful for what you've done for me. I owe you my life." He grimaced. I can already hear the but coming. "Yes, I'm sorry." She smiled gently, "But I need to leave." He really wasn't great at controlling his facial expressions. Taija could see him fighting to keep the hurt from his face, so she hurried on. "I need to find out what happened to me, where I came from, where my people are, and I can't do that here. You saved my life. Ramshorn has been good to me, but I need to know." She'd never been a great liar, but Alexei did seem to believe her. It probably helped that it was nothing but the truth that she needed to find out what had happened to her. He sighed deeply. "I'd hoped that. No, of course you need to go. I understand." Suddenly he was all business. "Where will you be going? When do you plan to leave? Have you thought about supplies?" Over the next few days, Taija got ready for her journey. She knew it would be a long way, further than she'd ever had to go under her own steam, and she felt woefully underprepared. Normally she'd just travel, making the journey in seconds. However, that was a lot more difficult when she knew nothing about Keemlin or even where she was. She tried opening gateways to a few places she was familiar with once she was back on your feet. Adanza, Jalanda, Tizora, even the Hall of the Servants, but every single one had failed, fizzling out in a bright flash of sparks and dissolving flows. It had been a risk even trying that. Once her head was in the right place, she placed a tied-off web on herself, concealing her ability to channel, and started spinning her webs inverted. But given how little she knew about the world as it stood, blindly traveling somewhere could easily get her killed. She'd gotten enough of an idea of the geography there to skim in Keemlin's general direction, and if any of the villagers could have given her a good enough description of the place, she could likely have just opened a gateway to the city. However, without even vaguely knowing what she might find at the other end, she wasn't willing to travel further than she could see. So that meant she needed to do things the hard way. She could always skip travel, using gateways within her line of sight to speed things up, but even that would be risky if anyone saw her. It was an intimidating thought, heading out into the unknown, on foot, but she had no choice. Supplies turned out to be easier than Taija had feared. Alexei and the villagers' kindness was hard to believe. They didn't have much, but they still give her food, a pack, even clothing. Although she couldn't say she enjoyed wearing their simple, scratchy dresses. Apparently, Elena had had to cut her out of her clothes after Alexei found her. She'd commented on the strangely colored, men's, clothing that was apparently very difficult to cut, and Taija had had to feign ignorance. So using her own clothes wasn't really an option. The only thing that seemed to have survived coming with her was her boots. Taija knew she'd be grateful for those soon. Well worn in and built to last, she was going to need them if she'd be walking as much as she expected. While she was getting ready to go, Taija continued to try to find out as much as she could about the world she was in. It was deeply frustrating that the villagers didn't know much about life outside their little region, but they told her what they could. Taija heard about other great cities, Tar Valon, a nest of witches and dark friends according to some, Kerhian, and the story of Laman's folly, Tyr and Elian, coastal cities united in mutual hate with an unassailable fortress in Tyr, and Ebu Dar, apparently they stab each other over nothing, and the women wear huge dagger necklaces. It was all very surface level, but at least it gave her some names of places to try if Keemlin couldn't give her what she needed. On the history of Andor and its geography, she learnt a lot more. About how Queen, President, maybe dictator. Morghese had been a good ruler, how there was a crisis before she took charge, and some basic history of the nation. Taija also heard about at least some of its larger cities, Whitebridge, Eringil, and Berlan, and to her surprise, one of the villagers actually turned out to have a map of the country. It looked like something out of a museum, hand-drawn, and she was sure a lot of artistic license had been taken, but it at least gave her a reasonable idea of where everything was, and the main rivers, mountains, and forests. Nothing looked familiar to her, unfortunately, but maybe if she could actually see these mountains of mist, she'd recognize them. She always did like hiking. When the day of Taija's departure arrived, she was surprised to see a large part of the village's population lined up to see her off. In the grand scheme of things, she hadn't spent very long there, and she couldn't say she'd particularly enjoyed that time. However, that wasn't their fault. It was still an emotional moment for her to say goodbye to these people who, despite having almost nothing by her standards, had been so kind to her. There was one notable absence from them, though. Taija hadn't seen Alexei all day, and looking around now, she still couldn't find him. He was the one she owed the most to, so it felt particularly sad that he wasn't there. Taija considered delaying until the next day, but eventually, with a small sigh, she hefted her pack onto her back. In the end, she needed to get going. She needed to find a way home. Whether someone chose to say goodbye or not, she was still alone wherever or whenever this was. Just as Taija turned to leave, she heard a commotion from just out of sight. She hesitated, and a second later Alexei came jogging round the corner, panting for breath with a pack and bow on his back and a staff held in his hand. Slowing to a saunter, he came up to her with a casual grin that was slightly ruined by his heavy breathing. "I couldn't let you go off on your own like that. You might end up needing to be rescued again." He paused. "Anyway, I've always wanted an adventure." Despite herself, Taija burst out laughing. This she had not expected. There were so many reasons to tell him absolutely not and to go home. He'd probably slow her down. No, he'd definitely slow her down. He also had no idea what he was getting himself into. He seemed to have a bit of a thing about Aes Sedai, which could be awkward. He also clearly had a crush on her, which could be even more awkward, especially given the age gap. It wasn't that he was bad-looking, but he was in his early 20s and had never left his village. Regardless of all the good reasons to say no, Taija just smiled. "Well, let's go then. Never mind the local knowledge and someone to watch her back." This world was a lonely place for Taija, and she considered him her first and only friend here. Travel without technology, or the power was, well, it was dull. Taija hadn't thought it would be all that bad. She used to go on long hikes in the mountains, although never for weeks at a time, and she'd always enjoyed them. Here, though the scenery was boring, other than her boots, her clothes sucked, and there were no showers at the end of each day. The first few days were fine, but Taija's mood worsened as they went. She got rained on. She couldn't use the power to clean herself as much as she wanted to do to Aleki's presence, so she felt dirty, and carrying a heavy, uncomfortable pack left her feeling more and more tired. Perhaps she wasn't as recovered from her injuries as she'd thought. All this made her increasingly grumpy as they trudged on. There were good moments, people being incredibly kind to strangers. The occasional in that Alexei paid for, even though she knew for a fact that he didn't have much money. The taste of freshly cooked rabbit that Alexei shot with his bow. But mostly it was a grind. Taija regularly fantasized about being in a car, with leather seats and air conditioning. Even a long-distance bus would do. Or alternatively, she could just skip travel her way to Kimlin to avoid the risks of traveling somewhere unfamiliar. Opening a gateway to the horizon, stepping through, and then repeating. She'd probably be there in a day or two at most. The only thing stopping her at that point was how Alexei might react. She didn't even care about the other locals. Much as her journey wore on her, Taija was still glad of the company Alexei brought. Long days walking or riding on the back of a cart gave her the chance to get to know him better. He really was a nice young man, telling her the stories of his people, about life growing up in Ramshun, and enthusing about finally getting to go on a proper adventure. The slow travel also gave Taija the chance to learn more about the world and improve her grasp of the language there. People still gave her odd looks, and despite Alexei's assurances, she could tell she had a strong accent. As far as she was concerned, their language just sounded mushy, and it was hard to properly imitate some of the sounds. During the journey, Taija gradually, tentatively asked Alexei about Aes Sedai and witchcraft, using the stasis box and her need to know where she came from as excuses to bring up the topics. Away from the box and the village, he was a lot more willing to talk, but she wasn't sure how much he really knew and how much was just myths or prejudice. He told her about how Aes Sedai ruled the world from the shadows and smote their enemies with their witchcraft, which really didn't sound right. While he knew they used the one power, the words Sedar and Sedin didn't seem to mean anything to him. She also learnt that they were based in Tar Valon, where they pulled on the strings of rulers around the world. Apparently they couldn't tell a lie, but would twist words into a knot and turn the truth on its head. More implausibly, Alexei said that the male Aes Sedai broke the world, and now there were only women. All male channelers are apparently insane and dangerous. He wasn't quite clear what that involved, but it seemed to be some apocalyptic event in the distant, almost forgotten past. Maybe something did happen. Taija wasn't even sure if this was her world or a parallel one, so who knew what the truth was? She supposed that maybe it was the end of the War of Power, but given how little he seemed to know about it, it was probably more of a creation myth than actual history. One thing that Taija couldn't get straight was whether Alexei thought Aes Sedai were dark friends or not. He seemed to think that they were untrustworthy and manipulative, but while he called Tar Valon a nest of dark friends and witchcraft, he didn't seem to think that individual Aes Sedai necessarily were. It was all a strange contrast to her world, where servants of all, one term that seems to have carried over to the local language, even if its meaning had been lost, were hugely respected. These conversations also led to Alexei asking more about Taija and her background. She dodged and deflected about her exact circumstances, but told him about her life in broad strokes. Growing up in Adanza, working as a scholar, and fighting in a war. Taija thought she did a good job of obfuscating the truth with her claims of amnesia. Regardless, he was faultlessly kind and didn't push her to say more than she wanted to, which just made her feel more guilty about lying to him. Of course, she had good reasons to do it, but he'd been nothing but open with her and was actually walking several hundred kilometers to help her. It didn't feel at all fair that she was repaying him with obfuscation and lies. Alexei had expected going on an adventure like this to be more exciting. He'd never traveled anything like this far from Ramshorn, and soon he was going to see Keemlin of all places, one of the greatest cities in the world. For now, though, his feet hurt, and he couldn't really think of the endless days of walking as anything other than drudgery. Of course, that was relieved somewhat by Taija, the reason he'd come in the first place. He glanced over at her. She was still scowling. Her mood really hadn't improved since they got caught in the rain that morning. He could have gone to Keemlin any time, of course, but she'd been the trigger. At first, he'd been terrified of her, given where she came from, but it had quickly become clear to him that she really was harmless. Just a nice lady who seemed to be lost after much hardship. Yet there was clearly an adventure to be had at the same time. Her mysterious origins, the injuries she'd had, the strange language she'd spoken, all harsh consonants, they all intrigued him. Even the clothing Alina had cut off her had been like nothing he'd seen before. He'd been disappointed when she'd said she needed to leave for Keemlin, but not really surprised. It hadn't been a difficult decision to go with her either. Someone needed to protect her from a world she was clearly clueless about. He'd entertained fantasies of marrying her for a while, but her lack of interest quickly became clear. That didn't stop him from wanting to go with her, though. Even the stories she'd told as they traveled had been fascinating. She claimed to have forgotten so much, but he was pretty sure she was lying about most of that. She clearly didn't know how she got to Ramshorn, but she was running from something. There were so many signs of it. There was the nervousness on her face when she was asked too many questions. Also the way she'd jump at any loud noise, whirling to face it with impressive speed. Even how difficult it was to sneak up on her was apparently a sign, according to old Moki, who'd spoken a lot with the guards on visiting peddlers' caravans. They all told a story of a traumatic past. His theory was that she'd been betrayed in some way. Maybe a noblewoman whose evil father tried to force her into an unwanted marriage until she'd fled. Perhaps she was from Shara. That might explain the language and the face she could channel, sending her to Ramshorn when he tried to punish her. It was as good an explanation as any. Hopefully soon she'd feel she could trust him enough to tell him her story. Until then, he'd help her reach Keemlin and maybe find some of the answers she was looking for. After that, they'd see. In the end, the journey was actually quite uneventful, and as they got closer to Keemlin, Taija found herself traveling down a proper, paved road. It was still very rough by her standards, but it and the gradually increasing volume of fellow travelers told her that they were getting close. It wasn't long after that she saw something on the horizon that slowly resolved itself into the walls of a sprawling city. Taija had never seen anything quite like it. Huge, shining white, stone walls stretched for kilometers, punctuated with looming guard towers. Buildings crowded up against the walls, and gleaming spires towered over them from the inside. It was hard to believe that this city had been built by people who didn't seem to have even heard of steam engines or concrete. Regardless, she knew that if it had been around in her world, the city would have been known everywhere. As a tourist attraction, if nothing else. Looking up at the shining walls, Taija mentally rubbed her hands together. This was a proper city, and no doubt she'd have a much easier time finding answers here. The first thing she was going to do, once they'd found some accommodation anyway, was visit their biggest public library. Chapter 5. Knowledge is Power, Guard It Well. Chapter text, Chapter V. Knowledge is Power. Guard it well. Once Taija was in Keemlin, her excitement quickly faded. She and Alexei had rented rooms at a ramshackle inn just outside the city walls, as it was all Alexei could afford. Even then, his money wouldn't last long. Still, that hadn't been the problem. While her room was both tiny and filthy, she didn't need much space, and a bit of channeling could deal with most cleanliness issues. Even where it couldn't, she'd slept in trenches, and this wasn't that bad, not quite. The real problem was that it rapidly became clear that finding information wouldn't be as easy as she had thought. After the kindness of the villagers in Ramshorn and the way Taija's own society worked, the realization that people in Keemlin were completely uninterested in helping her, and that to them she was just a random peasant, a countryru barely a step above a beggar, took a day or two to properly sink in. It also very soon became clear, after a couple of humiliating conversations, that public libraries were simply not a thing in Keemlin. Taija still winced at the way the innkeeper had looked at her, like she was a particularly stupid insect. All of this meant that she was going to need a new plan. Easy access to knowledge, public libraries, and cheap books all went into the growing mental list of things Taija missed from home. However, she wasn't going to think about that. That way led towards the encroaching darkness of depression. The question she needed to think about was, where could she get access to knowledge? The answer came pretty quickly. It was obvious that there were books in this world. Many of the people of Ramshorn were literate, which had actually been a bit of a surprise to Taija, given dimly remembered history lessons. She'd also seen at least one bookshop, although she'd been chased out of it before she could even look at their stock. Another humiliation. Regardless, books meant libraries, probably her favorite place to be, and in this strange medieval world she found herself in, if there were no public libraries, then there must be private ones. Much as she was already starting to dislike this place, a society without libraries seemed unimaginable. The inequality that was rife in Keemlin had been painful to see, but had been obvious almost as soon as she'd reached the city. Following that train of thought, Taija was fairly sure that it would be the rich that had private libraries, and so the palaces in the inner city seemed like an obvious starting place for her investigations. They were also just beautiful to look at with their sweeping architecture and marbled facades, even if she didn't really have time for gawking. Of course, Taija also needed to consider which rich people would have libraries. Some wouldn't be very interested in knowledge, science, history, things like that. More fool them. However, the really important people would surely have big libraries, even if they themselves weren't actually interested. Looking at the inequality on display, they'd probably have people to do their reading for them or something. Taija was quite pleased with her deduction. So little made sense here, but at least she seemed to be getting her head around some of how their society worked. This meant that the solution to Taija's woes was obvious. She would need to find the biggest palace, which she'd already done, and then break in and find the library. She sighed to herself. It would probably need to be at night. Getting caught would make things awkward. Still, while it wasn't like she was some kind of infiltration expert, the One Power was a flexible tool, and Taija was confident she could avoid any guards, particularly given the perplexing fact that she hadn't met a single channeler here. The next evening, after eating dinner with Alexei and discussing how her search was going, Taija told him that she was feeling a bit tired and would retire early for the night. She returned to her cramped room and embraced Sedai, briefly luxuriating in the feel of it before spinning a quick but complex inverted web of spirit, fire, air, and water that washed over her like a chill breeze. Another web created a mirror in the air in front of her, and she briefly studied her reflection. Instead of dark brown eyes, straight black hair, and light brown skin, she saw pretty green eyes staring out from a pale, freckled, younger face that was framed by ginger curls. It was perfect. She looked absolutely nothing like herself. Job done. She tied off the web of illusion and cracked open her door, checked the corridor was empty, and then hurried out of the back of the inn, unseen, except by the completely uninterested stable hand. It was getting dark outside as Taija walked unhurriedly towards what was probably this Morghase's palace. By now, she was fairly sure the woman was a queen bai, although she'd have to ask her if they ever met. One of the guards at the gate to the inner city moved, as if he was going to stop her. Another sign of the inequality in this world, but a deft flow of air knocked a flower pot off a balcony, distracting him just as Taija strode past. It didn't take long for Taija to reach the main gate to the palace. Obviously it was guarded, and she was under no illusion that she could just walk in there. She did, however, take a moment to admire the colorful uniforms of the guards before she walked on. They had a certain panache to them. Circling the palace's walls didn't reveal any obvious entry points, which was annoying but unsurprising. There were one or two points where she thought she might be able to haul herself over the wall, but it would look very suspicious as well as being undignified. There would likely be guards patrolling on the other side, too. It was annoying, but not a serious problem. Taija hadn't released Sedar since she left the inn. She had no intention of getting hit over the head by a mugger before she could do anything about it, and that would be her route into the palace. She drew harder on the power, spinning a complex, inverted web of spirit that made the space in front of her match that on the roof of a smaller palace overlooking the walls. The air split apart in front of her, and Taija stepped through her gateway. There, perfect. Now she could see over the walls and into the palace grounds. Even better, there were some large windows on what she thought was a ballroom or chamber of some kind. She spun a quick web, distorting the air in front of her eyes, and it was like she was looking through a telescope, light bent to magnify the image. Yes, the room looked empty. With a thought, Taija opened a second gateway beside her and stepped through, straight into the palace. As soon as the gateway vanished behind her, Taija had to stop as she looked around, open-mouthed. The opulence was incredible. She'd seen some truly stunning buildings in her life. The Hall of the Servants sprang to mind, but the style here was gaudier than anything she'd seen outside a museum. Huge paintings of elaborately, but archaically dressed men and women adorned the walls. Carved wood covered in gold leaf highlighted the corners and edges. Marble columns framed the windows, and the ceiling was covered in amazingly detailed frescoes depicting scenes of leisure. It took Taija a few seconds to shake herself out of her astonished reverie. It was beautiful, simply incredible, but she had more important things to do. She wasn't a tourist here to gawk. She knew she was in the right place, though. She could feel it. So, with a bounce to her step, she headed off to start searching the palace. Taija's feelings of excitement didn't last all that long. The problem with going to the biggest palace in Keemlin was that, well, it was the biggest palace. She was sure she'd been wandering around for over an hour without finding anything that even vaguely looked like a library, and several times she'd almost been caught by roving guards or servants hurrying about their chores. As a result, Taija was starting to feel quite irritable by the time she nudged a large pair of doors open and finally found her goal. It was dimly lit by moonlight shining through large, ornate windows, and it was hard to make much out. However, when she spun a ball of light above her head, the sight in front of her was enough to extinguish any grumpiness. It was simply beautiful. Wooden paneling, polished desks, cozy armchairs, and best of all, shelf after shelf of books. It felt like years since Taija had seen a book, and light she'd missed them. That being said, Taija wasn't sure where to start. There was no obvious catalogue, and the books didn't have helpfully clear spines like she was used to. So all she could do was pick one off the shelf at random. 10 Nobility and Bloodlines in the New Era. Taija mouthed the words out loud, struggling with the unfamiliar letters. Thank the light these people used almost the same alphabet as her, so at least she could work out which word was what. She read a few pages, holding the book open in front of her, struggling with the turgid language. However, she quickly concluded that she really didn't need to know about the family trees of the High Lords of Tyr, whatever they were. A bit more searching and browsing brought her to Principles of Mathematics by A. Petrina. That was actually quite interesting. Not because there were any new concepts in it, but because she could see how much people here knew. The answer seemed to be not all that much. Although Taija had to admit that she had no idea whether the book was cutting-edge thinking or a centuries-old classic. Either way, it was fascinating, why she'd never seen this particular proof expressed in this way. A couple of hours later, Taija looked up from the book with a jolt. She shouldn't have let herself become distracted. Quickly putting the book back where she'd found it and resisting the urge to just take it with her, she resumed her search. It wasn't too long before she found something far more useful sounding. The history of the 100 Years' War, from unity to destruction. That sounded like a proper history book, and hopefully she'd be able to get some more useful information about the world from it. Just its existence told her she must be a long way from home. The war was the only war she'd ever heard of, and that had only been going on for 5 years so far. Taking it off the shelf and returning to the wonderfully comfortable armchair she'd claimed, Taija settled down to read. It was almost light when she realized with a jolt of panic that she'd let herself become distracted again. Stifling a yawn, she quickly replaced the book on the shelf, glanced around to make sure she'd left no sign of her presence, and then spun an inverted gateway directly back to her room in the inn. Unfortunately, Taija didn't get much chance to sleep in. The thin walls of her cheap room did little to shield her from the sound of the inn's other occupants rousing themselves. As a result, despite her best efforts, she was quite irritable the next day. Alexei had been looking for work, and over an unappetizing breakfast, he told her about how he thought he'd found something which would support her in her search for answers. However, while he was happily telling her about that, Taija's mind was half back in the library and half wishing she was asleep, and all she could manage was one-word answers. The day felt like it crawled by, and all Taija could do was wait for night to fall so that she could go back to the library and continue with her reading. As soon as she'd gone to bed, she traveled directly to the library to get back to her research. Unlike the previous night, Taija refused to let herself get distracted, as difficult as that was, and she managed to finish the book on the 100 Years' War before getting to bed a little bit earlier than the night before. However, it was still far too little sleep, and the next morning, Taija's tiredness was like a hammer pounding through her head. She simply couldn't keep functioning for more than a few days with so little sleep. The guilty voice in the back of her head was also whispering increasingly loudly that she was taking advantage of Alexei's generosity in an unforgivable way. While Alexei protested when she told him she was going to try to find some work, Taija could still the relief in his eyes. Fortunately, it seemed that the Creator was smiling on her, as in the end all it took to find some work was a brief conversation with the innkeeper. With that, Taija became the inn's chambermaid, cleaning out the guests' rooms. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had to do such menial work, Ramshorn aside, and it paid terribly, but at least it let her feel she wasn't taking advantage of Alexei. Of course, Taija didn't actually spend hours cleaning the empty rooms. There was no one around in the upper floors during the day, so instead she simply used the power. A whirlwind of webs removing dust and dirt, cleaning it in seconds. It wouldn't have been so easy in a hotel in her own world, but here in this rough-in standards were considerably lower, something she preferred not to think about. At least it meant she could catch up on sleep even while on the clock. Each night Taija continued to visit the palace library. It was slow going, trying to work her way through the unfamiliar script, not helped by the poor quality of the printing in most of them. One was even handwritten. The 5 kingdoms of the north gave her some understanding of the borderlands, apparently making up the northernmost kingdoms, Shinar, Arafel, Ka-Endur, Saldir, and Malkia. Much of the content was tedious royal histories, but the book also touched on the Blight. So she now knew that the shadow still had a presence in this world, beyond villagers' fears of dark friends. It seemed that those kingdoms formed the bulwark against the shadow, or at least its conventional forces, which was interesting and might be worthy of more investigation later. The next book that Taija decided to read was more exciting. Tar Valon and the White Tower: Life Among the Servants. She already knew that Tar Valon was where the Aes Sedai of this world were based, and the White Tower seemed to be their version of the Hall of the Servants. She suspected that the reference to servants was a pun on Aes Sedai. She'd noticed occasional words from her language interspersed in the books she'd read, so it would make sense. Taija settled down in what was now her favorite armchair, tied off the web providing her with light, and got down to reading. In a matter of minutes, she was engrossed in the book, trailing her finger along the lines of text on the pages as she laboriously worked her way through it. Taija wasn't sure how long it was before she was pulled out of reading about the position of the Amulin seat by a noise. She looked up, blinking with surprise, to see a dark-haired woman standing over her, looking distinctly unimpressed. She was handsome rather than pretty, with a cold, severe look on her face. There was also something slightly off about her appearance, although Taija couldn't put her finger on what it was. As their eyes met, the glow of Sedar sprang up around the woman. Immediately, Taija instinctively grabbed for it herself. How could she have let herself become so distracted? Instead of the warm flow of the power, she felt a smooth barrier between her and Sedar. Fuck it, Taija frantically tried to master the surge of panic boiling up inside her, gripping the rough wool of her dress in her fists as the woman allowed a predatory smile onto her face. She looked Taija up and down, glanced up at the hovering light, and sniffed audibly. I was right. I did feel someone channeling last night. Taija kicked herself internally. How could she have been so stupid? Not inverting all of her webs, tying them off, and to crown it all, letting go of Sedar. Stupid, stupid, stupid. She needed to pull herself together before she got herself killed, if she hadn't already managed that. She clamped down hard on the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Answer me, girl. With a start, Taija realized the woman had been talking. Unless you wish it to go worse for you, you will tell me now. How exactly did you get in here, girl, and what do you think you are doing? The woman's voice spoke of command. Clearly someone used to being obeyed. Chapter 6. No, I really am Aes Sedai. Chapter text, chapter Romans 6. No, I really am Aes Sedai. Sat in her armchair, shielded and vulnerable. Taija desperately tried to suppress the panic that was welling up inside her. She knew what happened to Aes Sedai that were captured by the forces of the shadow. Torture and death were at the better end of possible outcomes. Even as Taija was forcing herself to keep breathing steadily, she was still looking for weaknesses, opportunities. She hadn't survived years of war by giving in to fear and indecision. Tentatively, Taija probed at the shield blocking her from Sedar. Surprisingly, it felt, for lack of a better word, sloppy. Without taking her eyes off her assailant, she carefully felt her way around the shape of the shield, hunting for weaknesses. She needed to stall for time. "WW, who are you?" she deliberately stammered. It wasn't difficult to allow a frightened quiver into her voice. I was just trying to read." Woman frowned slightly, her face impassive beyond that. "Do not try to play games with me, girl. Answer me, or you will suffer for it." Taija did not need to pretend to wince when the woman channeled, and a web of air lashed across her back. Still, that wasn't important. She'd had worse. Taija pushed gently at the shield, feeling the tangle of Sedar that was holding the web together. There was just a little bit of give, larger spaces than she expected between the flows. She was so close, if she could just... Ouch! WW, what was that for? Taija tried to make her bottom lip tremble and sound even more afraid. WW, why are you hitting me? Jay, just tell me who you are and I promise not to tell anyone. If she could mix her genuine fear with false bravado, she might be able to tempt the woman into... Oh, yes. The woman diverted more of her strength, dividing her flows into a web of illusion as well as her switch of air. Taija yelped as pain bloomed across her back from 2 more hard strikes, and the woman seemed to swell in size in front of her, looming ever larger. "Answer me, girl. Do not try to defy me." Her voice boomed out unnaturally loudly, shaking the glass in the windows. However, Taija was barely listening. Channeling even a small amount of her strength into the illusion and air switch reduced the amount she had to hold the shield, and that momentary weakness was all Taija needed. Fear and indecision vanished from her face, replaced by hard focus. Decades of channeling experience, years fighting on the front lines, came together and Taija struck, instantly attacking the knot at the center of the woman's shield. Exerting the full force of her ability as a channeler, focused precisely on the weak points in the woman's shield, prying into the sloppily large gaps between flows. Taija wasn't sure if it would have worked without the woman having diverted a small part of her strength. It was such a close-run thing. However, as it was, she felt the shield bulge briefly under the pressure she exerted, and then a moment later it burst like a soap bubble. The world moved in slow motion. As Sedar flowed back into her, Taija saw the woman flinch from the shock of her web breaking. She started to react, but Taija was far faster. In a fraction of a second, she was spinning a torrent of Sedar, splitting her flows 4 ways. Fire, Air and spirit formed a bowl between the two of them, exploding into blinding light, with a loud thump, even as Taija screwed her eyes shut and dived out of her chair to dodge any retaliation. A complex web of all 5 elements sprang out across the room to block attempts at traveling. A wall of air, spirit, and fire appeared between them to absorb any webs from the woman, and finally, an overpowered fist of air into her stomach sent her crashing noisily into a bookshelf. Even as the woman sunk to her knees, Taija was following through with an overpowered shield. She nearly spun the web with a razor-sharp edge, with the aim of severing the woman, but just held herself back. She still didn't know whether this was truly an enemy or not. She wasn't on the battlefield now. It was as effective as Taija could possibly have hoped. The woman had no time to recover from the shock of her own shield breaking. She was blinded and flung across the room with a squawk of surprise, briefly losing her connection to Sedai before Taija could even slam the shield into place. A moment later, Taija was picking herself up off the floor, brushing dust from her dress, and wincing slightly at the bands of pain across her body, where the woman had hit her with her webs of air. She'd probably be feeling those for at least a week, as it wasn't like she'd be able to get any healing here. Having checked herself over, Taija fixed her attention on the woman, who was also slowly pulling herself to her feet, using a shelf for support and clutching her stomach. There was a faint touch of pressure as the woman tested the shield, but Taija could feel the woman's strength. She hadn't the faintest hope of breaking it. For a second, Taija considered binding the woman in air, but decided she'd hold off, for now. The woman wasn't much of a threat given that she was shielded, and Taija could spin a web of air faster than the woman could possibly do anything to her at that distance. Taija thanked the light that the woman hadn't been a bit more skilled with Sedai, or just a little stronger, or she might have been in a lot more trouble. As it was, perhaps now she could get some answers for her questions. Based on the quality of her dress and her presence in the palace, woman was clearly rich, and obviously she was a channeler, so hopefully she'd actually have some education and be able to tell Taija about this world. Leaving her able to move freely might even help them resolve things peacefully. Also, now that Taija had a moment to think, she had to admit that the woman had reason to be suspicious of her. She had snuck into the palace after all, so she opted for a conciliatory tone when she spoke to the woman. "I'm very sorry about that unpleasantness. You caught me by surprise, and I panicked a bit." Taija gave her an awkward smile and tried to ignore the pain she felt from the woman's switches and the simmering anger that generated in her. Anger wouldn't serve her well now. Despite being shielded and surely knowing she was completely at Taija's mercy, the woman just gave her a haughtily impassive stare, looking down her nose at her. Taija stared back for a second and then sighed. "Look, I really—" Before she could finish, she was interrupted by the sound of shouts and running boots. In hindsight, maybe she could have been a bit quieter. Thinking fast, Taija bound the woman in air and yanked her closer, ignoring her shout of outrage. She could keep any non-channelers out of the library pretty much indefinitely, but she had no idea whether there were more channelers in the palace. She'd already put herself in a difficult situation by letting herself become complacent once. After a moment of consideration, Taija quickly spun an inverted gateway. Reading residues was a rare talent, so unlikely to be an issue, but she certainly didn't want to find out the hard way that someone could track her gateway. The hole in the air rotated open behind her, and she stepped back through it, straight into her room at the inn, before dragging the woman through after her with her web of air. As soon as the gateway rotated closed behind her, Taija warded the small room against sound. She didn't want the woman calling for help. She kept her shielded and bound with air, obviously. The room was far too small to keep any distance, and she'd heard of too many channelers who'd been complacent and ended up being punched or stabbed. With the room cut off from the sounds of the outside world, Taija turned her attention back to her captive. "Right," she hesitated, her tone awkward. "I'm sorry about that. I don't want to hurt you, but I also don't want to end up in some sort of dungeon. It's just too cliché if nothing else." She trailed off as her mind went back to some of the lower quality, historical fiction she'd used to read when she was younger. The woman was still looking around, blinking with surprise, her arrogant composure finally broken. "What was that?" There was a hint of worry in her voice. "Where are we? How did we get here?" Taija blinked at her, surprised. "We traveled." Her words were slow, as if speaking to a child. Did the woman not know how to make a gateway? She was certainly strong enough. For a moment the woman looked even more shocked, and then she pulled herself together, drawing her composure around herself like a shield. "I see," she replied. "I must have been confused. May I ask who you are?" While she still sounded as arrogant as a freshly minted member of the inner council, her tone had become somewhat more conciliatory. Taija couldn't see any reason to lie to the woman. If she recognized her name, then that would tell her something, but she didn't expect her to. "My name is Taija Kosola Murinen." Even years later, she couldn't help the little flash of pride that came with saying her third name. "Most people call me Taija Sedai, or Professor Kosola. Well, at least before the war they did. What's your name?" Rather than answering, the woman raised an eyebrow. "Sedai girl, you claim to be Aes Sedai." Her aggressive tone had returned. Taija shrugged, suppressing a flash of irritation at being called girl. She'd thought it was fairly obvious given the shield she was holding on the woman. It was possible, she supposed. Not every channeler became Aes Sedai, even if it was rare not to for strong ones. "Are you not one?" The woman allowed herself a measured smile. "My name is Eleda Davrini Rohan, and yes, you may call me Eleda Sedai." Taija gave her a genuine smile. "Oh, well, that's a pleasant surprise." It really was, not only an Aes Sedai, but one with a third name too. How fortunate to have found someone who would almost certainly have the knowledge and connections to be genuinely helpful. Although she'd still have to be careful, she hadn't forgotten some of what the villagers and Alexei had said about Aes Sedai here. "I really do have so many questions. Maybe you can help me with some of them." Aes Sedai to Aes Sedai. Eleda's response was more measured. "Perhaps I can, although I will tell you nothing that could harm the White Tower or Andor." She paused. "I will also warn you now, the consequences of claiming to be Aes Sedai are not light. The longer you maintain your pretense, the harsher the punishment will be, and you must know that the reach of the White Tower is without limits. You saw the false dragon Largain as he was brought through Keemlin. That is the fate that awaits all those who oppose the White Tower. If you will release the shield you hold on me and come peacefully to the palace, then I will ensure that any punishments are not overzealous." Taija blinked, confused by that. She might have heard the name Largain once or twice in other people's conversations, although she wasn't sure. It hadn't seemed particularly important or interesting at the time. As for this talk of claiming to be Aes Sedai, it was offensive. Although if she was fair to Eleda, perhaps this world had some sort of tests or signs for Aes Sedai. "Well, obviously I'm not impersonating an Aes Sedai, but that's neither here nor there right now. Maybe we can discuss that later. First, please tell me, what year is it?" This time Eleda looked nonplussed, clearly not expecting the question. "Ah, it is the year 998. Taija already knew that from Ramshorn. "Yes, but 998 of what?" "Of the new era." Eleda's reply was slow. She tried to work out where Taija was going with her questions. "All right, fine, but the new era of what? What was the old era? Was there an old era? Are you at least aware of the circular nature of the space-time continuum?" Taija realized after a second that she dropped into her own language due to her lack of vocabulary. "Other circle of time. You refer to the wheel, weaving our lives through the pattern and the ages." Eleda seemed to be halfway between asking and stating, but at Taija's nod she continued. "Yes, of course, even the meanest peasant knows about that. Where are you from, girl? I cannot place your accent." "I'm not from around here. Also, please don't call me girl, it's rude." Taija's reply was vague, but after a second she thought maybe she should offer more if she wanted to learn anything useful from Eleda. "I was born and raised in Adanza." Eleda's blank face made it clear that hadn't rung any bells. "I worked in Paran Disen for many years too before I ended up living in Jalanda. Maybe you know of them." The second name, the greatest city of Taija's world, seemed to have some impact on Eleda, although she only gave a small twitch on hearing it. "Must say I am not familiar with any of those places. But have you heard of them?" Taija leant forward, pinning her with her eyes. "I thought perhaps I had heard of this Perrin Dyson place." She mispronounced the name badly, but it would be difficult to say where. Eleda paused and then asked, "You say you worked there for some years. How long for, and what is it that you did?" Taija couldn't see any reason to obfuscate. "For around 25 years at the— I'm not sure how to say it in your language." I was again, I don't have the words. In Paran Disen I was a postdoctoral researcher in theoretical physics. She said the last few words in her own language. Aleda's eyebrows rose. That sounds like the old tongue, girl, although it appears you do not speak it as well as you think. Your pronunciation is atrocious, and you are telling me you spent 25 years as. Her voice took on a sarcastic tone, an after-scholar explorer of thought about world motion. I am surprised you know any words of the old tongue given your dress and accent, but clearly whoever taught you did not do it very well. You will also need to learn not to lie to an Aes Sedai, or things will go far worse for you. She sniffed loudly. There is no way that you could have spent 25 years working already at your age. Did you start when you were 5? With a humorless laugh, Aleda continued, speaking over Taija's attempt at interjecting. Now, for your own good, you must release me and accompany me to the White Tower. You will be punished for your impersonation of an Aes Sedai, of course, that cannot be overlooked. However, your obvious ignorance will speak in your favor if you can overcome your foolishness. You are not weak in the power, girl. Once amends have been made for your behavior, I have no doubt that you could find your life much improved from this. Her eyes contemptuously took in the shabby room and Taija's cheap dress. Taija was a little impressed, despite herself. Aleda was completely at her mercy, and yet she seemed to expect her orders to be followed as if she was the one in command. Fortunately, she wasn't. Taija said something vaguely conciliatory and tried to keep digging into the history of the world she found herself in. While she didn't get anything like the level of information she wanted out of Aleda, she was starting to be able to build more of a picture of things. She heard more about the nations and their histories. It seemed like they used to be united by a man named Otter Hawkwing, which was an excellent name, she had to admit. Before him, there were huge Trolloc wars. Both Hawkwing and those wars resulted in new calendars being adopted. Then something like 3,000 years ago, there had been this breaking. Apparently mad men had destroyed the world with the power. It just didn't sound very plausible. Even the worst destruction during the war never came close to what Aleda described. Regardless, Aleda didn't seem to want to talk about that in any detail, and Taija wasn't all that interested in exploring ancient myths. While Taija had learned more about the world, she was still only scratching the surface. There had to be some connection between their worlds. If nothing else, their common tongue was clearly related to her own language, and Aleda had recognized it, even had some vague idea of how to speak it, calling it the old tongue. Taija found herself yawning more and more as her questioning went on, which contrasted irritatingly with Aleda's unruffled composure. Eventually, she decided to try naming some things from her world to see if Aleda recognized them. Names of other cities got her nothing, so in desperation she tried some of people as well. The first few got her nowhere, but Aleda's eyes narrowed when she said, Luz Thurin Telemon. I am confused as to why you have been throwing these names without any purpose at me, but that one, yes, I am aware of the dragon, as would be any educated person. However, no civilized person wishes to speak of him. Aleda's mouth twisted into a grimace. Taija gasped, a smile growing on her face. Maybe she wasn't as far from home as she'd feared if Aleda had heard of Luz Thurin. She seemed to put a lot of weight on the title dragon, though. People had only started calling him that maybe a year ago, but really, as far as Taija was concerned, it was just another thing to feed the man's undeniably large ego. Eagerly, she tried to get more information out of Aleda, but all it revealed was that she was unwilling to give more answers on the topic. All she would do was lead the conversation back to unspeakable fates, like the one apparently to be faced by that login man she'd mentioned, and how Taija should be releasing her for her own good. It was at that point that Taija realized that the sun was shining through the tiny window to her room. She didn't hear any of the normal morning noise from the inn, but that made sense given the ward against sound. Unfortunately, there was no way to make that particular ward one way, not as far as she knew anyway. Alexei was probably panicking at her not having emerged from her room. For all Taija knew, he might be hammering on her door right now. Also, she was exhausted from lack of sleep. Annoyingly, Aleda looked completely unruffled. She needed to decide what she was going to do with Aleda quickly. She couldn't have Alexei get into her room and find she was holding one of this world's Aes Sedai prisoner with the power. She'd have to explain things to him at some point anyway, but that would really not be a good way to start the conversation. Taija looked back at Aleda, who seemed to think she was making headway with her threats. The woman was unquestionably dangerous, almost certainly highly influential given she was in the palace and had a third name, and she was an Aes Sedai of non-negligible strength in the power. She also seemed to feel Taija should be submitting to her authority. There was no real reason to think Aleda was a dark friend, but Taija clearly couldn't just release her. Equally, keeping her prisoner would be difficult. Morals aside, she didn't have a good idea of Aleda's capabilities, and regardless, she didn't have anywhere to put her. She could kill her, of course. Aleda did attack first, and that would be one problem solved. However, while it might be the easy way out, Taija was no dark friend. She wasn't that kind of person, and never would be. She could be ruthless, of course, when she needed to be, had seen and done far too much on the battlefield. There were times she'd wake up in a cold sweat reliving those things. However, as far as Taija knew, this Aleda hadn't actually done anything wrong, other than the beating with the power. Luckily, all Aleda had seen was a false face and the inside of a shabby room, which could no doubt be in any one of hundreds or even thousands of low-quality inns. She wouldn't even know it was an inn, so she'd have no chance of finding it again. It would be easy enough to just spin a gateway back to the palace, push Aleda through it, and then allow it to close again. However, Taija was feeling a bit petty. Aleda had attacked her without warning. She'd also beaten her without justification and wouldn't stop threatening her with unspecified punishments. Decision made, Taija gave her a thin smile. I think I've lost track of time a bit. Alexei had said these eyes said I couldn't tell a lie, although that sounded implausible, but Taija certainly could. I don't bear you any ill will. However, equally I'm not an idiot. I'm no dark friend, so I can't just make you disappear, easier as that might be. Taija channeled Sedar, spinning the flows into a complex, inverted web, and a gateway opened against the far wall of her room. Carefully she lifted Aleda on flows of air and moved her through it before following herself, keeping it held open behind her. A deft bit of work with the power lowered Aleda to the ground and tied off the air holding her in place, along with the shield blocking her from Sedar. Aleda was left sitting on a grassy hill, looking out over a lovely vista of rolling green hills with an occasional farmhouse or copse of trees punctuating them. I thought this was one of the prettier places I saw on my way here. Taija's tone was wistful. Nothing compared to home, of course, if you could see the mountains around Adanza. Well, anyway, she awkwardly smoothed her dress down with her hands, feeling the loss of her world for a few moments. You should just about be able to see the road to Keemlin that way. She pointed off to the left. Perhaps an hour's walk to the road, and then a day or so on your feet should see you back there. Taija looked doubtfully down at the soft slippers on Aleda's feet. Maybe a bit faster if someone with a wagon will give you a lift. She turned to leave, ignoring the aching feeling at the idea of going back to the shabby little room, leaving behind the only other channeler she'd met in this world. Oh yes, don't worry about the shield and bindings. They'll dissolve in the next few minutes. Without further ado, Taija stepped back through the gateway to her room. Maybe if they met again, Aleda wouldn't call her girl. It had been an exhausting night, but Taija thought she'd better check on what had been going on in the inn, so she allowed the ward around her room to fade and opened the door to find a furious-looking Alexei pacing outside it. Blood and bloody ashes, what in the light is going on? He demanded, barely restraining himself from shouting. Not a sound from your room, the door locked, and hours into the day. I was this close to breaking the door down in case you needed help. Aleda sat on the back of a cart, outwardly perfectly composed. On the inside, it was a different story. She was fuming to herself, angrier than she had been in years. That night had been probably the most humiliating experience she'd had since being raised to the shawl. She still had no idea how it had happened. She'd had the Wilder shielded, and then Taija had just casually broken it and overwhelmed her like it was nothing. None of it made any sense. No other woman in the tower could have done that, so how could an untrained Wilder? That wasn't to mention the rediscovery of traveling. As soon as she'd seen that hole in the air she'd known, she needed to take a less aggressive approach with this Taija. If she could be the one to bring that back to the tower, yet nothing had worked. Taija had just asked, and asked ever odder questions, while ignoring every promise and threat Aleda made. It was like she was from a different world, some of the questions she had. What calendar did they use? Light. The woman must have grown up under a rock. At least that would explain her strange, clipped accent. It was like every word had to be cut off short. As for what she'd said about Paran Disen and the dragon, what tosh. She clearly had an economical relationship with the truth. Eleda thought back to her first foretelling and suppressed a shiver. The Forsaken might know of the Age of Legends, but they were bound in Shale Gull, and even if they weren't, the idea that that small, nervous-looking woman and her awkward questions could be one of them was so laughable that it wasn't worth considering. At best, the woman needed to be apprehended and brought under control. At worst, she was some kind of dark friend, whatever her denials, in which case she would still need to be stopped. Either way, Eleda needed to be back in Keemlin. She looked down at the ruins of her slippers before, not for the first time, snapping angrily at the cringing farmer driving the cart. Can this thing not go any faster? Chapter 7. The Truth. Chapter text, chapter Romans 7, The Truth. Alexei stopped in mid-rant, confusion painted across his face. Ah, who are you? Anger replaced confusion. What are you doing in Taija's room? Before Taija could say anything, he shoved his way in, almost knocking her over with his larger frame, looking around it with wild eyes. Where's Taija? What have you done with her? He grabbed the front of her dress and shoved her against the wall. Taija barely restrained herself from flinging him across the room with the power. That hurt. It was frightening being manhandled by someone his size, even when she could channel and it had not been a good night. What are you doing? She snapped. I am Taija. Have you gone mad? Let go of me now. A moment later, realization hit, and she wanted to kick herself. She'd forgotten to undo the web of illusion. With a thought, the knot came undone, and her appearance shimmered as the illusion dissolved around her. At the same time, she discreetly pushed the door closed with a flow of air. Alexei stood there, mouth open in disbelief. He was still clutching the front of Taija's dress, although it now felt less like a threat and more like he needed it for support. Sit, Alexei. Taija gave him a gentle push, and despite their difference in size, he staggered back into the bed before half falling onto it, still staring wide-eyed at her. Absently, Taija rolled her shoulders. Being slammed into the wall had hurt. On top of what Eleda had done, she sighed deeply. Well, I've been planning to talk about this with you before, but this really isn't how I saw it happening. Let me think. Alexei finally regained his voice. Why you're an Aes Sedai? How? WW what? Taija sighed again. It's not so simple. I'll do my best to explain. All that I can ask is that you let me finish, and then I'll answer all of your questions as well as I can. I promise, no lies, just the truth. Taking a moment to think, Taija grimaced to herself. She had a great deal of obligation to Alexei after everything. Firstly, Alexei, I owe you an apology from the bottom of my heart. She bent into a deep, formal bow, looking at the floor after she spoke. I haven't been completely honest with you, and it's a poor repayment for everything you've done for me. When she straightened, it was with a wince. She really did feel battered. Alexei opened his mouth to speak, and Taija held up a hand to stop him. Please, let me finish first. This is going to be hard enough as it is. Alexei subsided, so Taija continued. Firstly, yes, I am an Aes Sedai. However, I don't think I'm really the same as the Aes Sedai you know. Until I met you, I'd never heard of the White Tower or Tar Valon. I'm not sure I'm from your world at all. To my shame, I lied to you about not remembering things from my past. I don't know exactly how I ended up in your field, but I do remember everything until then. I grew up in, I suppose you call it a paradise. My world was buildings of glass that reached the sky, cities that made Keemlin look like a village, beautiful nature at our feet. Ordinary people traveling across the world in a day just for a festival. No hunger, no disease. Everything you could want supplied by. She struggled to find an appropriate word. Clever devices and the one power. Aes Sedai working together and among the people for the common good. You know, the words Aes Sedai mean servant of all in my language. Taija's voice was wistful as she thought back to the times before the collapse. Those were the good times. Then it all went wrong. I was a scholar learning about the way the world worked, and some other scholars, Badaman and Mirin, did. Well, it's hard to explain, but after that the Dark One started to touch the world. People started to commit crimes. Evil slowly spread across the world. Life was still good. I was succeeding at my work. People respected me, and I became well known for my work. However, around me the world was gradually falling apart. Violence, rape, robbery, cheating, lying, they were all growing. I was living in my own bubble. Writing, debating, and learning, none of it really touched me except as a faint worry when my friends talked about the wider world. That all came to an end when the shadow finally struck. They'd been biding their time, hiding in the darkness, undermining everything that was good in the world for decades, and when they attacked, we weren't ready. Most of us had no idea what was happening. Taija shuddered as she forced herself to remember things she tried very hard to forget. The start of the war had probably been the worst day of her life. She just gave him a very brief summary, just so he understood. I was working in Jalanda. I'd earned my third name a few years before, and life was good. It was a sunny afternoon. I'd been planning to go out with a friend for, she switched briefly into her own language, a pizza and ice cream, but first I had to finish my work for the day. I heard a commotion outside, and when I looked out it was like nothing I'd seen before. An army, no, a horde of men and women were running through the streets. Cheering and shouting, they were shooting people when they saw them with bows and arrows, grabbing them and tearing them apart with their bare hands, or when they saw women they did worse. She should stop. That was enough, but once she'd started the words just kept coming. There were channelers with them too. Taija carefully didn't use the words Aes Sedai. I saw a man throwing fire at fleeing families, laughing as he burned a woman to ashes. A woman sweeping shards of broken glass through the air, shredding everyone around her. It was madness, horrifying madness. She shuddered at the memory, clutching at the skirt of her dress. Why was she still talking? I remember I got up from my desk, like I was in a dream, staggered out into the corridors of the physics department. I heard screaming through a door, coming from one of the nearby offices. I had to go and see. Light helped me, I knew everyone there. Alexei hadn't tried to interrupt her, just sitting there wide-eyed and horrified at her story, even if he looked a bit confused at the occasional slips into her own language. Ilaria was dead. I could see her insides spread across the floor. We'd had breakfast together that morning. Shinju was halfway up the wall. He was pinned there with a table leg straight through his chest, but he was still moving. I was at his wedding. They couldn't even channel to protect themselves. Taija couldn't stand thinking about that day, but nevertheless, once she'd started, she just couldn't stop. The terrible images indelibly pressed into her memory. Sarita was the one screaming. She was in the air, held there by Sedin. Belen, he was from another department, a chemist, was holding her there. I think he'd already severed her and was just cutting bits off her one by one while he stood there and laughed. I think I screamed, and he looked round and saw me standing there in the doorway. He didn't even hesitate, just cut her in half with a web of air and slammed me sideways into a wall so hard I blacked out. By the time I came to, he'd shielded me, grabbed me and pushed me onto a desk with his hands round my throat. He was whispering things to me, horrible things. Taija seemed to shrink around herself, tears rolling down her cheeks. I think he forgot that I was as strong as I was. I panicked and blew through his shield. I wasn't even thinking, I just needed to get him away from me. I'd always been careful and precise, but I just let loose with fire and earth. One huge explosion that obliterated everything around me, including him, even as I opened a gateway under me and fell through it. I think I must have brought the whole building down. I don't know how many of my friends and colleagues I must have killed. Hopefully none, but light help me, I don't know. I just don't know. I needed to escape and I fled. I could have stayed and fought. I should have stayed and fought. I'd probably have died, but maybe it would have been better if I had. Taija could feel tears trickling down her cheeks. That was the last day of the collapse and the first day of the war of power. Alexei placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, surprise overridden by horror on his face, and Taija continued on with her story, telling him as well as she could about how ancient, obsolete knowledge was repurposed towards war. Learning to fight with her partner, years fighting for the light, battling the shadow's forces. Leaving her life as a scholar behind, sacrificing her passions, and throwing herself into defending her world, her very way of life. Eventually, she finished, telling him about her last battle. How she desperately fled an opponent who outmatched her, maybe one of the Forsaken, reached Entiro, and then found herself in his world. How she wasn't sure whether she was in a different time or a completely different world. As she reached the end of that battle, she gave Alexei another low, formal bow, apologizing once more for lying to him. After she finished, completely drained from talking about things that she'd done her best to forget, there was a long silence. Alexei was almost visibly chewing things over as he processed her story. As promised, he kept silent, but that kind of revelation couldn't simply be shrugged off. Eventually, he came to a conclusion. Well, that was not what I was expecting. I can't say that I'm happy that you lied to me. I suspected you weren't telling me the whole truth, but not something like this. If I told the folk back home about this, they'd think I'd learnt to channel and gone crazy. But by the light, I do believe you. No one would invent a story so mad. Thank you. Taija's voice was no more than a nervous murmur. I think the Creator must have meant for this to happen. There must be a purpose to you being here. Elena always said the wheel weaves as the wheel wills, Alexei mused. Look, I've always dreamed of leaving Ramshorn, and now here I am on an adventure with an Aes Sedai for a friend. Maybe they'll sing songs about us. Either way, I'm here for you and I'll support you in any way I can, but on one condition. You have to promise no more lies. With a relieved laugh, Taija promised that without any hesitation. It was a huge relief to at least have been able to tell someone about what had happened to her. In her world, she'd had friends, a lover, colleagues, and a cause. A support network that kept her sane. However, here she found herself isolated from everything familiar and trying to function in total secrecy. It just wasn't sustainable. After all of her revelations, Alexei convinced her that they both needed a drink of something stronger than water. Despite her emotional and physical exhaustion, Taija agreed, and so they headed down to the inn's common room. Over a cup of wine, they talked more in low tones, and Taija explained what she'd been up to in Camelin. Alexei spat his wine across the table when she told him how she'd effectively kidnapped an Aes Sedai from Morghase's palace. When Taija explained how she'd left the woman to walk back to the city, he'd laughed, and at the same time been horrified at himself for laughing. After a couple of drinks, Taija felt able to articulate her fears to Alexei. When we were on our way to Camelin, you said some very negative things about Aes Sedai, but now you seem to be very relaxed about what I just told you. Why? Alexei thought for a second, the blur of alcohol in his eyes. I suppose you're different. I know you as a person. Every story of Aes Sedai says that they're mystical, aloof people. You're one of the more down-to-earth people I know. Lies aside. He gave her a sideways look. Based on the stories at least, you're not really a proper Aes Sedai. Taija wasn't sure whether to be amused or offended, but Alexei continued on relentlessly. Regardless, your story is more like something from a hero of the Horn of Valor. It's not something that makes any sense, but it's just very different from stories of Aes Sedai. He gave her a reassuring smile. It was sweet, but she felt a bit bad needing reassurance from someone who was a fraction of her age. Nevertheless, his acceptance relaxed Taija, and they kept drinking together. Alexei was a perceptive man, and despite Taija's best efforts at holding herself together, he inevitably noticed the wistful, distant look in Taija's eyes whenever she talked about things from her world. Eventually, he suggested that she tried telling him names of some of the most important places and people from her world. Perhaps he'd recognize some of them and be able to help her work out where she was, whether she was even in her own world. Perhaps fueled by alcohol, Taija started to enthusiastically list places, cities, people. Adanza and Jalanda were the most important cities for her, but they got no reaction. Paran Disen, the world's greatest city, was the same. People who'd been important to her life like Tel Janin and Tiro Bashiros, Sailor Lemoth and Gemamis, Nora received a similarly blank face. So did some of the villains of her world, such as Mirin Iranil and Elan Morin. However, when Taija mentioned Luz Thurin Telemon, it provoked more of a reaction. With an excited gasp, Alexei said, "Yes, I know that name. He was the dragon, the kinslayer who broke the world. I don't know much more than that, but they say he'll be reborn again to fight the Dark One and break the world once more." That was confusing. Taija knew that people had started calling him the dragon, but him being reborn, it sounded like superstition. Of course people were reborn through the ages, but without memories or abilities it was, for lack of a better word, meaningless. As for breaking the world, again that was ridiculous. He was a pompous man, absolutely full of himself, no question, but he was a loyal servant of the light, a great Aes Sedai. More superstition, perhaps. However, it was more evidence of some kind of link between this world and her own. They say that about Luz Thurin. Taija looked awkwardly at the floor. That doesn't sound like him. He was a bit of an arse when I spoke to him. That was the alcohol talking, but he was a good man. Why would he do something like that? What? You knew the dragon. If Alexei had been drinking, Taija was pretty sure he'd have spat out his drink. How? I don't understand. Alexei took a big swig of beer. He was the second person who'd recognized Luz Thurin's name, even if no one else's had rung a bell. That must mean something. Then a thought occurred to Taija. Perhaps she should try some of the Forsaken's names on him. Many of them he didn't recognize, but Lanfear and Ishmael horrified Alexei. When he heard those, he recited what was clearly a saying in his world. The Dark One and all of the Forsaken are bound in Sheol Gul, beyond the Great Blight, bound by the Creator at the moment of creation, bound until the end of time. For some reason, he didn't look very comforted when Taija acerbically replied, "Well, that can't be right since I've met them." Eventually, exhaustion and alcohol caught up with Taija, and she retreated to her room, slightly tipsy. Her head was whirling with the thoughts triggered by her conversation with Alexei. Thinking about everything she missed from her own world was bad enough, but him recognizing both Luz Thurin and some of the Forsaken strongly suggested that she was actually in her own world, but some time in the future. That would make sense with a stasis box. After all, they weren't used for traveling between worlds, but effectively for traveling through time, in a manner of speaking anyway. Taija had studied the portal stones and the theories around parallel worlds, and she still couldn't completely discount the possibility that she was actually in a parallel world and not her own, but it was looking less and less likely. Despite the alcohol, it took her a while to fall asleep as her mind kept picking over what might have gone wrong in her world for it to end up like this place. The next morning, Taija's head felt a lot clearer, and she was more able to consider her situation. The first thing that she realized was that she needed to get away from Keemlin. After her encounter with Aleda, the whole city would be hunting for her. She was confident that she wouldn't be found by any mundane means, given that Aleda had never seen her actual face. However, she didn't know what other tools Aleda had at her disposal. Over breakfast, Taija explained this to Alexei, and he agreed with her logic. She'd been thinking about where else she might go, and her best guess was that she might have better prospects in the borderlands. She'd read a bit about them in the palace library, and ultimately she needed some purpose to her life. Killing Shadowspawn would hardly hurt with that, and she also needed allies in this world, or time. Ultimately, it seemed much more likely that she'd find them somewhere where she could actually help people, rather than in a prosperous, by local standards anyway, peaceful city like Keemlin. There was probably time to plan her moves, given how unlikely it was that Aleda could find her quickly, but it was clear that Taija's time in Keemlin was limited. Over the next 2 days, Taija started getting ready for their move. Come nightfall, she masked herself in illusion once again, this time being careful to invert every web and conceal her own ability to channel before raiding a series of smaller palaces. It was child's play to use delving webs to find precious metals, and then making off with a small tax from each palace's vaults. While her conscience pricked at her, Taija told herself that those people could afford it, and she was only stealing out of necessity. Of course, Taija knew that when reports of mysterious thefts filtered back to Aleda, she'd immediately be the prime suspect, and people might put in place countermeasures, so she carried all of the thefts out in the same night. The next day she enacted her plan to bootstrap her and Alexei out of peasanthood. First came a battered, but well-kept, store where they bought better quality woolen outfits with silver pennies. An hour later they emerged, prosperous artisans rather than penniless peasants. Next came a better shop, smart but subdued. Taija emerged from that with a dress of finer cloth, top-quality wool, and several sets of clothing for Alexei, all paid for with silver marks. They became a prosperous merchant and her trusted retainer. Finally, they visited a fine tailor's in the inner city. Their Taija explained that they needed traveling clothes of excellent quality, and quickly too, as they'd been called away on duty for her house. Gold changed hands, and the tailor promised suitable attire for the next day. At the last tailor's, Taija didn't buy anything for Alexei, as he'd said that, at least in Andor, his way of speaking meant he'd look out of place in overly fine clothes. While it hadn't made a huge amount of sense to her that that would be such a big issue, she trusted his judgment, particularly on any cultural points relating to his world. When Taija returned from the tailor's a day later, her transformation into minor nobility was complete. Taija the peasant was gone, and the Lady Taija had arrived. Not that she'd used her real name with any of the purchases. There was no reason to tempt fate. Alexei had also insisted on the purchase of a trio of horses and saddlebags, despite Taija's insistence that they could just travel. She wasn't exactly keen on the animals, but she had to admit he was probably right. Finally, Taija also bought a map of the world, or at least of the bit of it that the people here were familiar with. With that, she could find her way towards her destination in the borderlands. Storing everything had been a bit tricky, but eventually, Taija ended up hiring a room and stable space at a much nicer inn, using her persona as a member of the nobility. Coming from a time where there was no such thing as nobility, it felt distinctly odd having an innkeeper bowing and scraping before her, but needs must. That evening, Taija felt things were ready, and she was able to travel back to the original inn from her new room, after changing into more appropriately down-market clothing, of course, to collect Alexei. He was initially terrified to step through the gateway that Taija spun, but after she demonstrated how it worked herself by stepping back and forth through the hole in the air, he agreed to follow her. Of course, once they were through, she took the time to give him a basic safety talk about gateways, before demonstrating their danger in a graphic manner by spinning one to open so that it sliced straight through the blade of a knife she held in her hand. With their reinvention complete, Taija decided that they'd leave the next morning. That evening, they settled down for dinner in the common room of their original dingy inn, intending to disappear to the more expensive inn to sleep afterwards, leaving Taija's old identity to vanish. Taija looked up from her rather mediocre bowl of soup when conversation in the common room stilled. It took her a moment to work out the reason. There was a trio of palace guards in their colorful armor being greeted by the worried-looking innkeeper. Her instincts were screaming at her that something wasn't right, so a small, inverted web of spirit and air extended towards the group let her eavesdrop on them. With disorienting suddenness, it was as if Taija was standing in the middle of their conversation, their voices as clear as day. Green eyes and curly red hair. Was that? It sounded like he was describing her illusion from Morgase's palace. Taija could see the innkeeper shaking his head, but she still reached over to Alexei, putting her hand on his arm to get his attention before urgently flicking her eyes up to the ceiling and their rooms. Luckily, Alexei got the message, and they both scraped their chairs back and stood before turning to head for the stairs. At the same time, Taija heard the guards say they were looking for a Taija. A glance told her that this time the innkeeper was nodding and pointing their way. They needed to get moving. Run! Taija urged Alexei past her and up the stairs while she turned to face the guards from the bottom step. Several lethal webs flashed through her mind, but she didn't want to hurt anyone here. The guards were just doing their jobs, and the other patrons of the inn weren't involved at all. So, with Alexei thumping up the stairs behind her, Taija spun a web of solid air around her ears, blocking all sound. Then, with a silent apology to her victims, she spun a simple clump of fire, air and spirit in front of her, subtly different to the one she'd used in the palace library with Aleda. Screwing her eyes shut, Taija pulled on a strand of spirit in the web. Even through her eyelids, she could see the blinding flash of light and feel the crash of sound from the detonation thump through her body. When Taija opened her eyes and let the webs over her ears dissolve, the common room was completely intact. The same couldn't be said for its occupants, who were on the floor moaning with pain, temporarily blind and deaf. They'd be fine in a few minutes. Send my regards to Aleda. Taija muttered the words before realizing no one could hear her. Well, it had sounded good in her head. She turned to hurry up the stairs. A couple of minutes later, she and Alexei had collected their remaining possessions and were stepping through a gateway to Taija's much larger, nicer room in their new inn. Another hour later there was settled, their horses loaded and saddled, and they were both heading out of the city, webs of illusion changing their faces. Taija hadn't wanted to travel straight from the inn. People might make the connection if she just disappeared from there too, so it was the slow way out for them at first. No one was interested in a noblewoman and her retainer riding out of the city. After an hour or so of trotting along, Taija had decided she hated horses. She was sore all over and felt vaguely sick from the motion. They had to be far enough from Keemlin now. Whether they were or not, she'd had enough. There was no one around, so with a gesture she dismounted, followed by Alexei, and led the horses off the road. Once they were out of sight of it, sheltered in a copse of trees, Taija pulled out the map she'd bought, spinning a ball of light to help them see in the dim light filtering through the branches. She'd been thinking about where to go, and with some discussion with Alexei, had decided on Shinar out of the borderland nations for no better reason than she liked the name, and Alexei hadn't objected. The nearest real city to the Blight seemed to be Fal Dara, and so Taija had decided that that would be her target. Unfortunately, she couldn't just open a gateway to there. She didn't know her destination at all, or her starting point well enough. However, with a bit of work, she was hopeful that she wouldn't have to spend too long sitting on a horse. She'd have to see how accurate her map really was. Taija took a moment to do some mental calculations, and then opened a large gateway to the void between worlds. Beckoning Alexei after her, she led her horse onto the platform she'd formed in the darkness on the other side of the gateway. As soon as they were both through, the gateway closed, and the platform started to move. She'd start with a jump of 1,000 kilometers at a 30-degree angle from north and see where she could go from there. It turned out that trying to triangulate her way across a sparsely inhabited medieval continent by skimming while using a hand-drawn map was not a very efficient way to get somewhere. It still beat horses, no question, but after several days of skimming, walking, sleeping, and more skimming, Taija and Alexei were both exhausted. Taija therefore greeted the sight of the walls of Fal Dara with almost ecstatic relief. She'd been starting to wonder whether they'd ever get there. The guards at on the gate gave her and Alexei hard looks when they arrived. It was already clear that the city was as much a fortress as a settlement, but the Lady Taija was granted entry without any real problems. Finding a nice inn didn't take too long, and with Taija's purloined funds, they were soon able to get some much-needed rest. The bathhouse was a particular pleasure. Hot water and cleanliness were something Taija sorely missed after their travels. Of course, she could clean herself with the power, but it wasn't really the same. Alexei, on the other hand, seemed less keen on the baths, calling them improper, although she wasn't totally sure why. The next day, Taija was ready to face the world once again and explore the city. She quickly realized that there were only two subjects of conversation for its citizens. The first was the arrival of an Aes Sedai a day or two ago. Apparently, this was a significant event. Initially, Taija thought they might be talking about her, but that was just silly given they'd have no way of knowing, which meant that there must be another. Interestingly, the people of Fal Dara spoke about Aes Sedai with respect, and or rather than the fear and suspicion she'd heard from the Andorans. However, the main thing people were talking about was the huge horde of Trollocs that was expected to descend upon the city. Hundreds of thousands of them. Apparently Fal Dara's ruler, one Lord Aegma, had ridden out with most of his forces to stop the horde somewhere called Tarwin's Gap. There was a lot of bravado about the upcoming battle, but reading between the lines, Taija recognized something she'd seen far too often during the War of Power. These people thought he'd gone there to die, and that the Trollocs would be at the city walls soon enough. Many of them were kind enough to advise her to leave, just in case, of course, even if they themselves planned to stay to defend their homes. It didn't take Taija long to realize that she needed to do something to help. She was still tired, but she'd had a good night to recover, and she couldn't just stand aside and allow Shadowspawn to slaughter innocents, let alone overrun an entire city. She might not be an army killer on the level of someone like Ida Sauna armed with a sangreal, but she wasn't the terrified, inexperienced scientist that she had been at the start of the war. She could still make a difference. She just needed to decide the best way to do it. Should she try to find this other Aes Sedai and work with them? Or should she go directly to help the army? She needed to think. Chapter 8. Where were the Aes Sedai? Chapter text Chapter Roman 8. Where were the Aes Sedai? Ultimately, what to do hadn't ended up being a difficult decision for Taija. Her last encounter with an Aes Sedai hadn't exactly gone well, and anyway, she didn't even know where this mysterious Aes Sedai was. Probably at the front lines with Lord Aegma if she knew her duty, but who knew? Either way, Taija's own duty to the light and to humanity was clear. Speaking of Lord Aegma, While it wasn't the way Taija normally liked to think about things, she needed allies in this world or time, and what better way was there to get one than by joining the battle on his behalf? With her decision made, it was time for action. Taija turned on her heel and marched off in search of Alexei. Streams of people seemed to be moving south, mostly women and children, presumably fleeing the city in anticipation of the approaching Trolloc army, and Taija had to push her way through the crowd. Fortunately, Alexei hadn't left the inn before she found him on his own way out with his bow across his back and staff in hand. Taija didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Alexei, I need to go. There's an army of shadow spawn coming. I can't just stand by and let them fight it alone." He was quite protective of her. She could still visualize the anger on his face when he'd burst into her room thinking she was someone else. "Don't try to stop me. I'm not injured anymore, and I'm not some flower to—" Alexei cut her off mid-sentence. "I know, I'm coming with you." Tajas seamlessly switched tracks. "No, you can't. It's too dangerous. There are tens of thousands of Trollocs, Midral, and worse out there. You're not a trained warrior. You can't channel and—" Taija lowered her voice. "And I think the Sheenarans are going to lose." Alexei looked disappointed at her words. "Maybe I'm not, maybe they will. But you can't expect me to wait here, letting other people die to protect me. You said it yourself. It's dangerous. You'll need someone to watch your back." The hard set of his face was enough to tell Taija she wouldn't be able to convince him otherwise. Also, he did have a point. She could hardly say she couldn't stand aside and then ask him to. It would admittedly be good to have someone to watch her back, too. She didn't know these Sheenarans, and a lone fighter was often a dead fighter. So after a moment's thought, she gave in. "Fine, but you obey every order I give you or I'll tie you up in air and leave you behind." She paused long enough for Alexei to nod and ignored the excited grin that spread across his face. He'd never been in a battle before. Lucky him. He'd learn, though, sadly. "Follow me. I want to get out of sight." She strode up to her room, Alexei trailing behind. As soon as the door was shut behind them, she embraced Sedar, spinning an inverted web to skim in the direction of Tarwin's Gap. It was only a short journey that time, and the two of them emerged onto dusty ground, surrounded by looming mountains. Taija took a moment to appraise them. They could be beautiful, but as it was, there was something subtly ugly about them, something she didn't like at all. There was very little alive around them, and what little plant life there was looked sickly and smelt of disease. Those must be the signs of the blight that she'd read about. In the distance to their north, Taija could see what she hoped was the Sheenaran army preparing for battle. While she could faintly hear shouted orders and the call of trumpets, she didn't think there were the sounds of battle, no screams for one thing. She could only hope they weren't too late. She briefly considered traveling directly to the Sheenaran lines, but that risked a surprised soldier stabbing her. It wasn't far anyway, and she could do with the time to think. So instead, the two of them headed towards the army on foot, plans whirling through Taija's mind. The problem was that she had very little idea what the battle would be like. Presumably, the forces of the Shadow would be just as backwards as everyone else here was, or else they'd have had no trouble marching south in the past. Only having to face arrows, swords, and spears must surely change things. Also, given the way people talked about Aes Sedai, and the fact that she had encountered so few of them herself, there couldn't be many involved on either side. This would drastically change the dynamics. Still, she would need to be careful. Overconfidence had been the end of many an Aes Sedai on the battlefield. It wasn't long before they were spotted, and a squad of riders came galloping back from the army to interrupt her musings. Their leader called out as they reined in their horses. "What are you doing, woman? Do you wish to die today, or are you a dark friend here to help the Shadow? I can see that you are no Sheenaran." Taija didn't break her stride. "My name is Taija Kosola Murnan, and I am Aes Sedai. We have come to help you with your fight against the forces of the Dark One. Please take us to Lord Agemar at once so that I can discuss how I can best help." It was offensive being asked if she was a dark friend, but it wasn't an unreasonable question. The Sheenaran officer hesitated. "Honor to you, Aes Sedai, but—" Taija could see the doubt in his face as he looked her over. "You must understand I have no knowledge of you. Why are you on foot and coming with no warning? Where have you come from to not be seen by the scouts?" It was annoying, but the man had a point. She should have brought a horse. She must look ridiculous, too, walking in the middle of nowhere in this stupid dress. Still, she didn't have time to argue. "I am Aes Sedai, and there is no time for discussion." Taija channeled, forming an illusion of front of her in the shape of the symbol of the Aes Sedai, sinuous white and black balancing each other and forming a circle together. Do you need to see more? Do your comrades have time for it before the Trollocs attack? The man hesitated again, and then bowed low in the saddle, apparently unwilling to challenge her further. My apologies, Aes Sedai. I am Sergeant Nerima. We shall bring you to Lord Aegema at once. He pointed to two of his soldiers. Ko, eke your horses for the Aes Sedai and her warder. You will have to walk back. Both soldiers bowed in the saddle the same way he had, and immediately dismounted without protest. A minute later, Taija was galloping back towards the army with the rest of the squad, desperately trying to pretend she knew how to ride and avoid falling off her horse. The soldiers riding beside her were definitely giving her odd looks. When they reached the main body of the army, they reined in their horses, slowing to a trot, except for Sergeant Nerima, who pulled ahead to prepare the way to Lord Aegema. It wasn't long before they reached a cluster of mounted soldiers with an older man in the center, his head shaved other than a top knot. His ornate armor seemed to mark him out as a man of some importance, presumably the Lord. Sergeant Nerima quickly introduced her. This is her Lord Aegema, Taija Sedai. There was a slight hesitation before the word Sedai. Lord Aegema turned to face Taija. Be welcome, Taija Sedai. It warms my heart that the White Tower is able to provide help to us in this time of need. I am only saddened that I was not able to provide you with the hospitality of Fal Dara before you arrived here. Taija noticed his eyes flick to her hand and back to her face. There seemed to be a lot of tension in the air, the soldiers' hands hovering over their swords as Lord Aegema continued. I beg forgiveness for my rudeness, said I, but you do not have the look of your sisters. Taija hesitated. This was a dangerous situation. Clearly something she'd done had made him suspicious. Possibly it was the appearing out of thin air without a horse. She really should have thought of that. Regardless, she certainly didn't have time for the truth, so hopefully she could bluff being one of this world's Aes Sedai successfully. She was lucky they'd be looking for reasons to believe her given their situation. Lord Aegema, when I heard of your plight, of Sheena's plight, I couldn't do anything but rush immediately to the battlefield to help. I've had little time for anything else. As for my looks, Taija tried for an innocent smile. Not all Aes Sedai have the same appearance. Lord Aegema's eyes narrowed. It was rather strange thinking of someone as a lord. Hereditary nobility was a deeply archaic concept. However, before he could interject, Taija wrenched her mind away from social hierarchies and barreled on. The most important thing is that I'm here to help. I'm not as experienced in the ways of war here in the borderlands as I'd hope, so please just tell me where my talents will be most useful in supporting your men, and I will go there. There was a long pause, and then Lord Aegema reached a decision. Where the fighting is heaviest, Aes Sedai, that is where you will be most needed. Sergeant Nerima will take you to the vanguard and ensure that you are kept safe. He gave Taija a bow, much shallower than the sergeant's earlier one. After a moment he continued, by the way, may I ask which Agi you claim, Taija Sedai? Shit. Taija could remember from her reading that the Aes Sedai were divided into colored Ages, but the book hadn't said what the significance was, or at least she hadn't reached that part. Anyway, they were clearly misusing the word Aja, not that that helped her now. After a moment's thought, she picked one, mainly because it was her favorite color. The red Aja Lord Aegema. His eyebrows rose and he glanced at Alexei. For a second, Taija thought she'd made a mistake, but then he continued smoothly on. Of course, Taija, said I. The two Sheenarans exchanged a significant look, and then Sergeant Nerima was back in front of Taija. Please, follow me, said I. Taija hardly considered herself a master politician, but she could tell that Lord Agulmar didn't fully believe her. However, he must have accepted her story to some degree, as no swords had been drawn. She suspected that she was being put where she was because it gave them the best opportunity to kill her if she did turn out to be a dark friend. Certainly in the vanguard of their forces wasn't where she'd expect a channeler to have the most impact. However, if she wanted to be trusted, she had little choice but to acquiesce to Lord Aegema's wishes. If she was right about the poor weaponry available to the Trollocs, it wasn't like stealth would be as important as usual anyway. When they reached the front line, almost in the center of the Sheenaran army, Taija could see the seething mass of shadow spawn only 500 or so meters away. Hundreds of black-cloaked Myrddraal were riding back and forth, in front of an uncountable horde of Trollocs. The darts of what were probably dragcar circled in the sky above them. It was certainly different. If an army had lined up like this in Taija's world, it would have ceased to exist within minutes. Artillery, shark lances, the power. None of these were friendly to massed formations in the open. Even the distance was wrong. A few hundred meters might protect you from arrows, but it wasn't much of a barrier to the power. There was a tension in the air as the armies faced off against each other. The human forces were vastly outnumbered, but were clearly ready to sell their lives dearly. Taija herself shifted from foot to foot, trying to stifle her own nervousness. Alexi's excitement at her side wasn't helping. The troops around Taija shifted, some falling back and new ones taking their places. A grizzled, scarred man who probably scared small children just by looking at them gave her a low bow and said that they were there to make sure that no harm came to the honored Aes Sedai. With the hard looks the new soldiers gave her, Taija had no doubt that they were also there to make sure that the honored Aes Sedai didn't turn out to be a dark friend. Still, they were faultlessly polite and respectful. It felt like hours of waiting, but Taija suspected it had only been 10 or 20 minutes before horns started to wail amidst the Trollocs. A moment later a roar swelled up from their ranks, and the wall of shadow spawn surged towards her and the Sheenaran lines. Taija was vaguely aware of Alexei taking up position by her shoulder while around her swords were unsheathed, lances set and spears readied. She had more important things on her mind, though, opening herself further to Sedar, feeling the trickle of the power increase to a flood. However, for now she held back. This was a marathon, not a sprint, limiting her channeling to a tied-off shield of air above her to protect her from arrows. Some proper armor would have been nice. Taija knew she was already a bit worn down, that she needed to preserve her energy, so she kept holding off as the Trolloc horde got closer. 400 meters, 350 meters, 300. The range was closing, bestial howls creating an overwhelming noise battering her ears. Deadly, sleek Myrddraal led the charge on coal-black horses. Huge flight of arrows went over Taija's head, towards the onrushing monsters, and even as the Sheenarans yelled battle cries, leveling their weapons, Taija decided the enemy was close enough, and she wouldn't be burning energy unnecessarily. Calmly she picked her targets, pacing herself. An instant later flows of earth, fire, and spirit connected her with the 5 closest Myrddraal, and they simply exploded in a flash of black blood and gore. A beat of her heart, and another 5 met the same fate. And again. And again. The part of the Trolloc horde in front of her actually hesitated as their leadership rapidly died, those at the front stumbling, falling, and being trampled by the monsters behind them. At the same time, the Sheenarans cheered and hollered, breaking into a charge towards the stunned beasts. Taija followed behind at a more sedate pace, surrounded by her escorts. There were no more Myrddraal within easy range. No doubt they were around, but spotting them was difficult, so she drew on Sedar, forming a large, more complex web of air, fire, and water above the closest clump of wavering Trollocs. An eerie howl started to echo through the air as her web began to rotate, gathering air into razor-sharp shards. It rose in pitch with the accelerating blades of air, until with a thought she brought it down into the Trollocs. 50 of them vanished in sprays of blood and bone. Taija continued her slow, measured advance, face a mask of expressionless focus as she swept her web left and right, blades passing through Trollocs like a knife through butter. It didn't take long, a few seconds perhaps. The Trollocs closest to her broke and ran. Taija wasn't surprised given the lack of Myrddraal to stiffen their spines. That was why she'd started with them. As the Trollocs ran, others along the line turned to flee too, until the Sheenarans were once again left disengaged from the fight, too disciplined to wildly pursue the fleeing Trollocs. Shouted commands and horn blasts rang out from the Sheenaran army, and the soldiers around her started to make their way back to their starting positions. They suddenly seemed to be in much better spirits, joking and boasting with each other. As the Sheenaran lines reformed in front of her, Taija was pleased to note that there were almost no human bodies near her after the devastation she'd wrought on the shadow spawn. Even her grim-faced escorts, who were urging her back with the rest of the Sheenarans, suddenly seemed to be torn between stunned surprise and almost obsequious fawning. Back in place behind the reformed Sheenarans, Taija looked over to the Trollocs once more. The horde looked barely diminished, despite being quickly beaten back the first time. How many more attacks could she and the Sheenarans survive? Perhaps something to soften them up and remind them that just because they were out of bow range, it didn't mean they were safe. She spun, and lightning struck into the Trolloc lines, each bolt throwing broken corpses into the air. Equals. The next few hours were a bloody grind as attack after attack hit the Sheenaran lines. Wherever Taija went, the Shadow's forces melted back. For them, she was death incarnate. Any shadow spawn that tried to stand and fight died, and when she couldn't find leaders to target, she simply killed Trollocs indiscriminately. However, the Trolloc army seemed to be endless. Piles of dead shadow spawn formed walls between the armies, too many to count, but the Sheenarans died too, and gradually the forces of the light were being pushed back. Step by grim step, each Trolloc attack was faced by fewer human soldiers, a little bit closer to the open ground behind Tarwin's Gap. As the fighting raged, Taija caught occasional glimpses of Lord Aegir battling wherever the struggle was fiercest, rallying his troops and urging them on through their exhaustion. When he saw Taija, he threw her a salute before cutting down a Trolloc. Taija was growing increasingly tired as the day went on. Even pacing herself and being careful not to channel to her full potential, fighting for hours on end was exhausting. There were occasional pauses in the battle, when she could sit on the ground, ignoring the blood and churned up mud, and take grateful gulps of lukewarm water from a Sheenaran's flask. But nevertheless, it was grueling, almost constant combat. As the latest attack rolled towards her, a twisted wall of Trollocs and Myrddraal screaming for blood, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. This time, it felt like the Shadow's forces had decided to target Taija specifically. She drew harder on the power, embracing an ever-deepening river of Sedar. This wasn't a time to hold back. Spinning deadly webs, faster than the eye could see, she killed shadow spawn in ever greater numbers. Despite the howling fanaticism of the monsters, Taija was keeping an open space in front of her for at least 50 meters, and where any shadow spawn came too close, it simply died. However, Taija was so focused on the Shadow's forces in front her, a growing mountain of corpses was evidence of their determination to reach her, that she didn't see them pressing back the Sheenaran lines on either side of her. She barely noticed Lord Aegir riding up to support the men on her left, screaming curses and imprecations to hold the line. As howling monsters died under her webs in front of her, Taija didn't realize she'd ended up surrounded by a closing ring of shadow spawn. Not until Alexei shoved her hard to one side with a curse, a Myrddraal's black blade swiping from behind her through the air where she had been standing before lashing back, viper-fast, and narrowly missing Alexei when he jumped back. Taija fell hard into the dirt. Fuck. She only kept hold of Sedar through years of practice. Her composure gone, she actually made a panicked gesture to direct the web of water and spirit that left the Myrddraal collapsing bonelessly to the ground. Looking up and finally taking stock of her wider surroundings, Taija realized that a ring of armored men, including Lord Aegir, encircled her, desperately fighting off the seemingly endless shadow spawn that now separated them from the remainder of the Sheenaran forces. Taija took a moment to push herself back onto her feet. Alexei was much bigger than her, and being thrown to the ground like that had hurt. Still, nothing seemed to be broken. If she and Lord Aegir died here, then the battle was over. She needed to punch her way out of this encirclement right now. Taija clenched her fists at her side, clutching her dress, and drew deeper on Sedar, feeling the little spikes of sweet, ecstatic pain that told her when she was drawing right at her limit. Fire, spirit, and air created potential difference between the clear sky and the Trollocs and Myrddraal all around them. A second later, lightning stabbed down, tens of bolts exploding among the enemy, sending monstrous, broken bodies flying into the air. A Myrddraal killed its way through the line of Sheenarans, sword flickering lightning fast and evading every counter-stroke before sprinting towards her. With an absent thought, fire erupted from every pore in its body. She had to be careful not to kill Sheenarans too. Taija guided her flows into webs further back among the press of Trollocs, splitting them 4 ways, forming every element into intricate webs that suddenly blossomed into beautiful, swirling balls of white-hot fire, each one annihilating everything within 50 meters. The pressure on the Sheenaran lines suddenly fell away, as the Trollocs fighting them realized that much of their support had just disappeared, but they still fought. Out of the corner of her eye, Taija saw Alexei loose his bow, and a second later a drag car fell out of the sky. She looked up to see more diving on her. Alexei's bow claimed another. The other 5 crumpled in mid-flight as she crushed them in fists of air. Taija briefly staggered before regaining control of herself and turning her attention back to the shadow spawn pressing at the Sheenarans. She knew she was reaching her limits, pushing past what was safe. It didn't matter. She lashed out, simple webs of air and fire spearing Trollocs and Myrddraal through the head. Small and precise, wherever she saw an enemy. She channeled hard, dividing her flows first 5 ways, then 10, ignoring the growing, stabbing pain in her head. Then suddenly the cacophony of combat was gone, replaced by blissful quiet as the last Trolloc died. Taija's vision wavered for a second, and she couldn't stop herself from falling to one knee, panting for breath as exhaustion truly hit. Reluctantly, she let go of Sedar before she lost control of it and burnt herself out, or worse. Alexei was immediately by her side, helping her stand, but as the battered Sheenaran lines reformed, Taija could easily see that despite the mounds of corpses between the armies, the Trolloc horde still hugely outnumbered them. She wasn't sure she or the Sheenarans could take one more charge, and she certainly wouldn't be able to take 2. The rest of the army knew it too. She could feel a sense of defeat, a grim determination to sell their lives dearly settling over them. The sensible thing to do would be to travel somewhere else, anywhere else, but Taija wasn't willing to leave the Sheenarans to their fate. Anyway, she wasn't sure she had it in her to travel by that point, even if she wanted to. Thinking she could turn the tide of the entire battle single-handed had been stupid, ridiculous hubris. Taija could see the Shadow's forces forming up for another charge, horns blaring and Trollocs roaring and shrieking when something changed. First, she heard the rumble of thunder, and when she looked up there were 6 small shapes plummeting from the sky, trailing smoke. Then a wall of fire descended on the army of the Shadow, a gigantic burning wave, obliterating anything it passed over. Had the mysterious other Aes Sedai finally decided to intervene? Taija quickly dismissed the thought when she realized with a start that she couldn't feel the mystery channeler's flows. Alexei had been clear that here only women were Aes Sedai, stupid as that was. Someone out there was channeling Sedin. In fact, someone was channeling a ridiculous amount of Sadin. Even someone of Luz Thurin's strength would need an Angreal or maybe a Sangreal to do this. Frantically, Taija tried to find them, eyes scanning the mountainsides closer to the shadow spawn, trying to ignore the blazing flames until she spotted a small figure up above the battlefield. Taija drew on the power, ignoring the strain she felt at even relatively light channeling. As the ground started to rumble under her feet, she was forming the air in front of her into a lens, zooming in on the figure. It was very quickly obvious that she'd been right about it being Sedin. A young, red-headed man knelt there, seeming to be in pain, beating the ground with thirst. Was he burning out? Taija was vaguely aware of a huge wall of rock, no, a wave, rolling over the Shadow's army and obliterating what was left of it. Seconds later, the figure vanished in a flash of light, and Taija allowed her web of air to dissolve. Around her, soldiers started to cheer as they got over their disbelief. Victory! For the light! For Lord Aegma! For Shinar! Glory to the Aes Sedai! Lord Aegma rode up to Taija and bowed low in the saddle, his previous doubts apparently forgotten. "Honor to you, Taija Sedai, you have saved us today. Such power." He stared out towards where the Trolloc army once stood. Taija gave him a small bow of her own. "The honor is mine, Lord Aegma, but I didn't do that. I'm not that powerful, no one is." He frowned slightly, and Taija got the impression that hadn't been the answer he wanted. "Well, you have certainly allowed us to survive long enough for this miracle to happen, even if it was not you that brought it." He looked over the battlefield at the mounds of dead shadow spawn. "You must come back with me to Fal Dara so that you can rest and be honored as you deserve, Aes Sedai." Taija was too tired to argue, even if the last thing she wanted was to be back on a horse. Anyway, it wasn't like there was anywhere else for her to go. Lord Aegma sat in his study reviewing reports from the battle. All things considered, the butcher's bill had been incredibly light. Peace. He had not expected any of them to survive the battle. Much of that he attributed to the conundrum he was hosting. Taija Sedai. He did not hesitate to use the honorific now. While he still had his doubts, the rest of the Sheenarans did not, and she had more than proven herself. He was no expert on the Aes Sedai, but he was an educated man and had played host to many of them before. Taija Sedai lacked the ageless face and did not wear the great serpent ring. That was not definitive, of course. Very new Aes Sedai did lack the agelessness, and a ring could be taken off. Based on what she had said, it sounded like she had been on some kind of mission that required secrecy prior to the battle and had chosen to break cover in order to help the Sheenarans. He was hardly going to complain about that, a woman who truly understood duty. And what help it had been. He had fought beside Aes Sedai before, but he had never seen anything like that. Waves of shadow spawn had broken on her channeling, mounds of their dead piled high. Just hours and hours of relentless slaughter from one woman. Some Aes Sedai were more powerful than others. He knew that much, although not how one could generally tell. She must be of prodigious power, though, based on the sheer number of the creatures she had killed. Of course, they would still have lost to the seemingly endless horde if not for the mysterious man on the mountain. How he wished that had been Taija Sedai's doing instead. But she had ensured far more Sheenarans survived to fight again than would otherwise have been the case. They owed her a huge debt. Still, though, there were other oddities. Her accent and manner of speech. He had met people from around the world, even spoken with Ale, yet he had never heard an accent like hers. Words clipped short, emphasis placed on harsh consonants. It was very strange. That went with the way she spoke. Her grammar and choice of words were more akin to a barely educated peasant than someone who had been educated in the White Tower or the noblewoman her clothes suggested. Then there was the way she sometimes seemed to fumble slightly for words that should have been obvious. It was very curious. She had also said she was Red Adger, which made no sense at all. Of course, Lord Aegema had hosted the occasional Red in Fal Dara. They did venture this far north in their hunt for male channelers, but one thing he had thought was written in stone was that members of the Red Adger did not have warders, yet Taija Sedai clearly did. She also seemed oddly disinterested in the man who had been channeling on the mountainside. Of course, no one had been close enough to tell what he looked like, but she hadn't even tried to investigate. Then again, Aes Sedai could often be inscrutable, looking like they were doing one thing while in fact working towards an entirely different goal. However, he still could not work out why she had essentially locked herself in his library after they had returned. Regardless, it did not matter. She was clearly a channeler. She was no dark friend, and she had done both him and Shinar a great service, putting herself at personal risk to help them. As far as he was concerned, if she said she was Aes Sedai, then she was Aes Sedai and less, and until other Aes Sedai said something different, and he would honor her as such. The White Tower harshly punished those who falsely claimed the title in very public ways, and she must be aware of that. He would make sure that when Moiraine Sedai returned, Taija Sedai was informed before they encountered each other. He could at least do her that service, and then if she chose to vanish, well, she had more than earned it, and the gate guards knew to turn a blind eye. It had taken a while for the battered army to limp back to Fal Dara, but once they got there, Taija was certainly pleased with the luxurious apartment that she'd been given. Alexei had told her that he'd never even seen anything like the rooms he'd been given. Annoyingly, the Fal Daran culture seemed to require that men and women had completely separate living spaces, so he couldn't be given the rooms next to her, so she felt a bit isolated. They'd been very apologetic, of course, understanding that an Aes Sedai wanted to be close to her warder, but it seemed that rules were rules. Taija wasn't totally sure why they kept calling Alexei her warder, but if she was understanding the word correctly, perhaps it was a cultural thing coming from him guarding her during the battle. In a sense, he had warded her against danger after all. It was a couple of days later, when Taija was finally feeling fully recovered, that one of the servants excitedly knocked on the door to her rooms and told her that Moiraine Sedai had returned, and Taija's presence had been requested by Lord Aegema at her convenience. Taija took the time to change into one of the many fine dresses that Lord Aegema had so kindly given her. There seemed to be a lot of red among them, perhaps because of what she'd said to the man when they first met. The dresses were beautiful, but she was already fed up with the fiddly and elaborate clothing. It wasn't that she didn't enjoy wearing a nice dress, Of course she did, but for special occasions when she wanted to look her best. When it came to day-to-day wear, let alone on a battlefield, she'd much rather have something practical. Still, as she headed off to find Alexei, she did think she looked good in the finely embroidered red silk. Once she had him at her side, the two of them headed towards Lord Aegimer's audience chamber together. While she was excited to finally meet the Aes Sedai, Taija was also struggling to suppress her nervousness. This would be the second Aes Sedai she'd met from this world, and she really hoped it went better than the last time. Still, at least this time, she knew to take precautions. She held Sedar, of course, but concealed it along with her ability to channel under a pair of inverted webs. Moiraine wouldn't know she was holding Sedar or be able to judge her strength. She'd be giving nothing away this time. She also had questions about what the woman had been doing instead of supporting the Sheenarans. She didn't know enough about this world to condemn her outright, but it was deeply suspicious that she hadn't been there on the battlefield. When Taija reached the audience chamber, she was immediately shown in, Alexei cheerfully following behind her. Lord Aegimer was in there with his wife and a small group of men and women, along with an Argyr. How nice to see one of them. Lord Aegimer turned from his guests to face Taija with a smile. "Ah, Taija," said I, "thank you for coming. You will no doubt have met Moiraine," said I before. Taija saw a small woman standing with the Argyr and the other humans. Her dark hair cascaded down in ringlets, and she wore a small gem on her forehead and a large ring on her left hand. Moiraine's eyes flicked to Taija's own hands, without her expression changing. Taija bowed to her as she would to a colleague she didn't know very well with a guarded smile. "It's an honor. I hope that your journey here went well, and that we'll be able to spend plenty of time catching up soon." There, that sounded politely neutral without revealing that the two of them had never met. As soon as she spoke, Taija noticed Moiraine's eyes twitch. It was a small movement, but she got the impression that the other woman's face didn't show many unguarded moments. "Yes, I am sure we will have much to discuss." Moiraine smiled back politely as Lord Aegimer looked on. Her accent was as mushy as the rest of theirs. Taija cast her eyes over Moiraine's companions, taking in the tall, hard-faced man standing beside the woman armed with a sword. He looked dangerous. Her nervousness increased a notch as she realized the two girls could channel too, so it would be 3 against 1 if it came to anything. Unconsciously, she began to shape inverted flows of fire, air, and spirit into a ball. There were also 3 young men, boys really. One huge and bearded, one looking somewhat sickly, and Taija did a visible double take as her eyes settled on him. One with red hair who looked worryingly like the young man she saw on the mountainside. Across the room, as she saw Taija's reaction, Moiraine's eyes narrowed slightly. Chapter 9. Imprisoned for 3,000 years. Chapter text, chapter Roman 9, trapped for 3,000 years. Taija ended up making polite small talk with Lord Aegimer, his wife, and Moiraine. Aegimer and his wife were formal people, perhaps a little too stiff for Taija's liking, but she thought was just the way Sheenarans were. They certainly seemed happy to chat with her, although she had to be a bit vague when they spoke about Tar Valon. Moiraine joined in with the conversation too. Her body language was relaxed, and she laughed along with Taija when Lord Aegimer's wife told a story about a mishap he had with his uncle, the King of Shinar. However, even as her laughter sounded out across the room, her eyes never left Taija, always watching and calculating. It didn't take long for Taija to start to feel uncomfortable under that gaze. What was going on in Moiraine's head? Was this just what Aes Sedai here were like? Nevertheless, Taija was still eager to get her alone. Moiraine certainly seemed like a more pleasant person than Elada, although maybe that was just the way they'd first met. Hero of a battle rather than intruder in the night. Moiraine's companions didn't say much, but Taija did notice that Alexei had at least managed to get a couple of the young men talking to him. After a while, Lord Aegimer apologized and said he needed to leave to inspect the city's grain stores, and the group broke up with everyone heading about their business. It was while she was walking with Alexei afterwards that Taija realized she hadn't actually been told the names of any of Moiraine's companions, other than the Argyr, Loyal, who had joined in with their conversation. It was a bit odd, actually. Why wouldn't Moiraine introduce them all? Luckily, when she mentioned it to Alexei, he was able to tell her who they were. Apparently, the two girls were named Nynaeve and Egwene. Taija guessed they might be Moriaine's apprentices based on their age. From the boys, he said the larger bearded one was Perrin, and the slightly sickly-looking one was Matt. The red-head was the one Taija was really interested in, of course, and apparently he was called Rand. Alexei said they were all a bit reluctant to talk to him, especially Matt, who'd seemed rather sullen. To be fair, they were teenagers, but Taija didn't point that out to him. He was, however, able to find out a little bit from Perrin and Rand, as they had opened up slightly when they found he was from Andor, although apparently their region of Andor was only sort of Andor, which she didn't quite understand. The girls had apparently just looked down their noses at him, which seemed rather rude. It took Taija a few days before she could pin Moiraine down for a talk. She saw her around the keep at the center of Fal Dara, but she was always moving, busy or deep in conversation with one lord or lady or another. Every time they met, she was faultlessly polite and apologetic, but Taija was soon starting to feel that Moiraine was trying to avoid being alone with her. In the end, perhaps she was just busy, because eventually she did invite Taija to her rooms to take tea with her. That was why a few days later Taija found herself sitting in Moiraine's beautifully appointed rooms, while a pair of fawningly deferential serving women set up an impressively elaborate tea for the honored Aes Sedai, before quickly withdrawing. Without speaking, Moiraine poured tea into Taija's cup first, and then her own. It was oddly formal, and Taija wondered whether there was some kind of ritual going on that she wasn't aware of. With the tea poured, Moiraine took her finely painted cup and raised it to her lips, fixing Taija with her sharp, blue-eyed gaze. Nothing showed on her face, but there was a tiny tremble in her hand as she did so. "Please, Taija," said I. There was an infinitesimal pause between Taija's name and the honorific, "Drink." Moiraine followed her own command, taking a sip from the cup. As had become her habit since Keemlin, Taija had applied inverted webs to herself, hiding her ability to channel, and when she was embracing Sedar. So she doubted Moiraine knew when she spun a small, complex web of all 5 elements around her cup. A moment later it had confirmed the tea wasn't poisoned. Or at least probably wasn't poisoned, the web wasn't infallible, and things might be different here. Still, there was justified paranoia, and then there was madness. As Taija took a sip, she sighed to herself. Even without the deep loneliness of being torn away from everyone she loved, this world was making her more paranoid by the day. Watching Moiraine take another sip of her own tea, she idly wondered whether the woman was also holding Sedar and concealing it, or if she was really as relaxed as she looked. Perhaps she was. Moiraine had no reason to suspect her of anything after all. In the end, it didn't matter. Taija needed to befriend the woman. Aes Sedai in this world clearly had huge influence, even where they were disliked or mistrusted, and she couldn't go making enemies of more of them. It also seemed like they would be the most likely people to be able to help her find out what had happened and maybe even get home again. Being open with Alexei had worked out much better than she'd expected, and maybe it would also work with Moiraine. If not, well, Taija knew Moiraine was no stronger than Eleda, and she could face that problem head-on. So, after exchanging generic pleasantries about the tea and the weather, Taija offered Moiraine her best smile. "Moiraine," said I, "I'm very grateful for your invitation. I know you're a very busy woman, but I have so very many questions, and I'm hopeful that you'll be able to help." Moiraine returned her smile, but hers was a little cooler, more dignified. "Of course, I will answer what I can, and I am sure that I will in turn have many questions for you." She paused, her eyes tightening ever so slightly. "But if I might ask something first, I cannot say where your accent comes from. You must be far from home." Taija slumped slightly in her seat. "Yes, a very long way, I think. To be honest with you, I don't really know where home is anymore. Have you heard of Adanza, Jalanda?" Moiraine raised an impeccably groomed eyebrow. "I do not believe so, but if you are not familiar with our cities, maybe you have heard of Paran Disen. It is said to have been the greatest city in the Age of Legends, I believe. Your histories might mention it." Taija was sure the woman's hands were trembling slightly. But why? It was disappointing that Moiraine hadn't heard of Taija's birthplace or her home as an adult, but still, she clearly knew something about Paran Disen. That was a start. "Some people would certainly say it's the greatest city in the world, but what do you mean by the Age of Legends?" The way Moiraine had spoken made it sound like this age of legends was something everyone should know about, so Taija felt a little awkward asking. Also, it was a stupid name, like writing, "Here be monsters" on a map. The Age of Legends. Moiraine sounded unsurprised at Taija's question. After a moment's thought, she launched into an explanation about a magical utopian world. Some things seemed familiar, others ridiculous. However, it was with dawning horror that Taija realized that it sounded like Moiraine was describing her world before and then during the war. An odd, twisted version of it, with some bits being outright wrong, but she recognized enough. Places, names, events made it clear what Moiraine meant. It sounded like mythology, but it was just too close. Much too close. Taija knew what she needed to ask. She didn't want to because she already knew on some level that she wasn't going to like the answer, but she needed to hear it. How long ago was this Age of Legends? Taija hated herself for stammering, but she couldn't help it. She scrubbed roughly at her eyes with her forearm. Moiraine's gaze seemed to intensify, her eyes piercing into Taija. Records are unclear, but scholars think it ended approximately 3,000 years ago when the dragon— Taija cut her off, standing abruptly. Blood was pounding through her head, and her vision was dimming at the edges. "I'm sorry, I need to go. I don't feel well." With that feeble excuse, Taija fled, breaking into a run as soon as she'd left. She needed to get back to her own rooms where she could safely put up a ward against sound and be alone. Taija didn't re-emerge from her rooms for 2 full days. Worried servants were told she was unwell, and everyone else she simply refused to see, not even Alexei. She needed time to process the realization. Up until that point, she'd been operating on adrenaline, necessity, and a healthy dose of ignorance. However, learning that she was over 3,000 years in the future, 3,000 inescapable years away from home, brought it all crashing down. She'd been tempted to simply flee, to get away from everyone, but where would she have gone? Camelin, Ramshorn. At least in Fal Dara she had comfortable, safe rooms. If it had been a parallel world, she might have had a route home. The portal stones proved the possibility of travel between worlds, and while it wasn't her direct specialism, it was an area she had some knowledge in. Time travel, on the other hand, was, as far as anyone had ever found out, completely impossible. Except forward, of course, she just demonstrated that, but there was no point to that. Everyone she knew had been dead for centuries. Fiancé, friends, comrades, even people she didn't like. She was stuck, alone, in some shithole backwards medieval world. What had these people done to regress to this level? Even the war of power still seemed to be rumbling on at some low level, even though the opposition these people seemed to face would have been dealt with in hours if they hadn't given up on technology, society, everything. The toxic combination of rage, depression, and anguished frustration flooding through Taija still continued to simmer beneath the surface when she finally felt able to leave her rooms. However, at least she had it under control. She didn't want to snap at anyone or lose her temper. It wasn't these people's fault that their ancestors had failed so horrendously. Taija still didn't really want to talk to anyone, so she found herself wandering up to the top of the city's walls and walking around them, nodding in response to the respectful bows of the soldiers patrolling them. After the first circuit, she made another and then another, allowing the relative peace and quiet under the warm sun to soothe her mood. She was on her 4th circuit when Moiraine found her. She'd climbed the steps onto the walls alone and joined Taija, keeping silent at first. Taija was happy to let that silence continue, but eventually Moiraine spoke. "I take it the Age of Legends is more than a story to you." Taija briefly considered lying, but it would hardly be very convincing. "Yes, I'm sorry for running off like that. It was just, I hadn't realized. I only started to suspect when I was in Keemlin last week, but I'd hoped." Moiraine seemed to twitch slightly at the mention of her being in Keemlin. Maybe she knew the place well. "I had suspected you were from far away, but I am still surprised to hear you say that. It must be very strange for you. Do you know how you got here?" Taija nodded sadly. "I was caught, trapped I suppose, in a stasis box, I think during a battle. Something must have gone wrong, but I'm not really sure. One second there was fighting, a powerful man was targeting me. I was injured, and then the next time, well, I'm here with no idea where I am." Moiraine's lips tightened. "That must have been very difficult for you." "Yes, I suppose it has been." Taija didn't offer any more than that, and there was another long silence before she spoke again. Tell me, Moiraine, said I, do you know what happened? Why aren't we still in the, her mouth twisted at the name, Age of Legends? You must understand, records from that time are scant. So much of what I say is conjecture, unfortunately. But this I know. The War of Power, you are aware of the War of Power. Taija nodded. Yes, I fought in it. The War of Power ended the Age of Legends with the breaking. Taija could hear the capitalization of the word. When Luz Thurin Telamon, the dragon, led a strike on Shael Gull to reseal the Dark One's prison, that was the end. He succeeded, but the Dark One's counterstroke tainted Sedin, sending him instantly and completely mad. Him and all of his companions. That was the start of the breaking. That sounded worryingly plausible based on the small amount of information Taija had heard elsewhere. Luz Thurin, you idiot. You stupid fucking idiot. Taija muttered to herself, without realizing she'd reverted to her own language. Moiraine continued as if Taija hadn't spoken. Following that, slowly but inevitably every male Aes Sedai went mad, killing everyone they encountered and remaking the world around them. It is said that mountains were moved and the very shape of the lands changed before the end of the breaking, and we were truly lucky that anyone survived at all. I know little more than this. Taija's heart was sinking further and further as Moiraine spoke. She could see how attacking the Dark One's prison could send a man mad, but all men, it was impossible. It had to be myth. Backwards people rationalizing events of millennia ago. 3,000 years. Taija stopped walking and looked at Moiraine. So you're telling me that not only is everyone from my time long dead, there's nothing left at all other than history books. She fully expected it, but Moiraine's nod still hurt. I'm sorry, but records are so sparse that even your name has likely been lost to the depths of history. Why did she look so calculating when she said that? Chapter 10. Well, this is awkward. Chapter text Chapter X. Well, this is awkward. Over the following days, Taija met with Moiraine and talked about the world she was in. No, not the world, the time, the present day. She needed to keep in mind that this was her world. Moiraine seemed reluctant to talk about the White Tower or Aes Sedai, always dancing around the topic, but told amusing stories of her travels around the world and gave detailed recountings of what was not the more recent past. In turn, Taija told her snippets about her own life. Moiraine seemed a bit reluctant to press for information, probably because she was just being sensitive to Taija's loss, and in truth, Taija was quite grateful for it. While she was starting to get her head around her situation, and her talks with Moiraine were helping, she couldn't help that her mind kept going back to Adanza, Jalanda, Paran Disen, her fiancé, comrades on the front lines, even academic rivals from before the war. Another thing on Taija's mind was that she hadn't thanked the young red-headed man yet. Randall Thor. She'd found out his full name from some of the servants, or Lord Rand as they called him. So Taija made an effort to track him down, asking after him at every opportunity, going to where she'd been told he'd be. Even if she might have been able to escape the battle, if she was lucky, by summoning up enough energy to travel, he'd probably saved her life, and had definitely saved the lives of everyone else in the Sheenaran army at Tarwin's Gap. However, every time Taija got close to him, she found something stopping her from speaking to him. Sometimes it was Moiraine popping up to talk to her. Other times it was Lan, Moiraine's warder, calling him away for training, or a servant telling him or Taija that someone or other needed them. In the meantime, though, Taija at least had the chance to talk a bit with Moiraine's other traveling companions. Lan, Moiraine's warder, was cold and hard, although she was fairly sure there was a lot going on in his head behind the composed exterior. Regardless, though, all Taija could get out of him was distant, but perfect politeness. The other two boys were easier to get hold of and at least more talkative than Lan. Perrin was a sweet young man, quiet and thoughtful, but Taija was at least able to have a nice conversation with him about the two rivers, the area he was from. Matt seemed the more interesting of the two. He was clearly a bit of a scoundrel, and on some level, Taija could feel there was something deeply wrong with the dagger on his waist that he kept touching. However, when she caught him somewhat tipsy at a table in a bar, he regaled her with tales of traveling through Andor and laughed, along with her own stories about mishaps hiking through the mountains near Adanza. That was quite pleasant right up until he remembered she was an Aes Sedai. The moment he realized, He suddenly backed off with a combination of awkwardness, fear, and anger on his face that was less than pleasant. After that, Matt had quickly excused himself and fled. The girls, Egwene and Nynaeve, didn't seem overly friendly, sadly. Egwene had been excited when Taija first spoke to her, wanting to talk about Tar Valon and Aes Sedai. However, she quickly closed off, turning her nose up at her. Taija wasn't sure why, but felt mildly offended. Nynaeve was a bit older, and when she spoke to Taija, she clearly made a point of not using her title. However, unlike Matt, who simply seemed to have forgotten, that seemed to be deliberate disrespect rather than friendliness. Taija could practically sense the resentment from her when she talked about getting the three boys and Egwene home safely. Nynaeve had looked defiantly into her eyes and said that she wouldn't allow Aes Sedai manipulation of them. It was pretty irritating, in fact. Taija was fairly sure Nynaeve wouldn't speak to Moiraine like that. Such were the rewards for trying to be pleasant. Telling Nynaeve she had no intention of manipulating anyone just seemed to make her more irritable. In the end, Taija made her excuses and left Nynaeve to herself before she pulled her braid out. The final member of Moiraine's party, Loyal, was somewhat different. In better times, Taija suspected that she'd be much keener to speak to the young Argier. However, as it was, whenever she saw him, he didn't seem able to help himself, asking questions about where she was from, her accent, and her background in his low, rumbling voice, before remembering himself and returning to polite formality. Taija did her best not to be rude to him, but in her current mindset, she really didn't want to discuss where she came from with a barely adult, book-obsessed Argier. After a week of trying to speak to Rand, Taija couldn't deny it. Someone was trying to stop her from seeing him. Fine. There was something going on there, and as some of the Sheenaran soldiers put it, she was blood and bloody ashes going to find out what it was. One of the funnier things she'd seen here was the locals' facial expressions when they heard her swear. Obviously, they didn't expect it from a woman, or possibly an Aes Sedai. Or maybe, Taija could secretly admit, she just hadn't quite got the hang of it in their language. Regardless, she started watching Rand's movements more carefully. If she wasn't just trying to overcome whoever kept getting in the way, she'd call it creepy. After a few days, she had results, though. He seemed to spend a lot of time practicing fencing alone with Lan in a particular tower. She'd heard several of the men in Fal Dara talking in admiring tones about how young Lord Rand was to be a blade master, so she assumed he must be quite good. One morning, Taija waited for him to go to the top of his favored tower to train with Lan, and then made her own discreet way to another tower where she could see them from across the walls. A deft couple of inverted webs allowed her to disappear into the background as light was bent around her. It wasn't perfect. If she moved, there would be some distortion in the air, but it would have to do. Suitably concealed, Taija then spun Sedar into a gateway, far more complex than normal, combining the web with one of illusion so that when it opened right next to the crenellations of Rand's tower, there was nothing more than a faint shimmer in the air for her to step through. Even though she knew she was moving almost completely silently, and the gateway had closed behind her, the clash of their swords wasn't so distracting that Lan didn't look up suspiciously, glancing round the space on top of the tower. Luckily, he didn't notice the less than faint shimmer in the air that was Taija as she froze, although her heart threatened to leap out of her throat for a second. Staying still, she should have been completely invisible, but he still nearly found her. She would definitely not be able to move anymore. It felt like hours that Taija had to stand there, completely still, watching the clash of practice swords. It wasn't all bad. She was hardly an expert on fencing, but she'd been to enough matches as a supporter in her time that she could appreciate the skill. She was also quite impressed by the sheer array of scars on Lan's toned, topless body. She'd never seen anything quite like it, although she supposed these people didn't have quite the same level of medical care that she was used to. Eventually, however, they stopped their practice and put their wooden swords down, sweat glistening on their muscles in the afternoon sun. It was then that Taija released her web of illusion and started clapping. Bravo! That was really impressive. Lan whirled towards her, frighteningly fast, reaching for a sword that he'd left propped up a few meters away against the wall. Taija barely restrained herself from wrapping him in air. He was a big man. Rand, on the other hand, actually jumped with a loud shout of surprise. Sorry. Taija quickly apologized. That seemed like a much better idea in my head than it turned out to be. Please forgive me. I was just hoping to have a word with young our Lord Rand here. I owe him some thanks. She gave them a friendly smile. Lan took a step towards her. Taija said, I honor to you, but the boy is tired. At the same time, Rand asked, Thank me for what? Taija said. For saving my life, of course. And the Sheenarans, too. You saved all of us at Tarwin's Gap, and for that I owe you my deepest gratitude. Taija gave him a low bow. Is there a reason why nobody calls you Aes Sedai? You're young, but with that display, you must have been channeling for some time. The tests should be trivial, and there's no question about your service. Taija's came to a crashing halt as she saw the looks of horror on both Rand and Lan's faces. Actually, it was the first time she'd seen any expression other than grim on Lan's face. She thought he must have hidden depths, but they were very well hidden. Internally, she was kicking herself. She'd allowed her enthusiasm to make her tread all over these people's weird prejudices about male channelers. Of course, Rand wasn't an Aes Sedai. They wouldn't allow it. Rand was speechless, his jaw working, but no sound coming out of his mouth. Lan, on the other hand, seemed to snap out of his frozen stupor after a second. He gave Taija a tiny bow and then sprinted for the hatch leading down from the tower without another word. Taija winced. This was not the reaction she was expecting. Look, Lord Rand, I'm sorry, I think I've upset you and Lan. She apologized again. I really didn't mean to. I just want to say thank you to you, that's all. Rand was clearly still trying to process what had been said, so Taija tentatively offered him a compliment. You must be very strong in the power. Rand finally found his voice in response to that, but it was frantic denial. I'm not a lord or an Aes said. I mean, I can't channel, Taija said. I swear I won't do it again. He slumped. Have you come to gentle me? They said you were Red Adger. Taija was really struggling with his reaction. She knew these people had a strange taboo about men channeling. It seemed to come from what Moiraine had said about the breaking and poor Luz Thurin, but after 3,000 years, it was a ridiculous overreaction. Still, she should do her best to be sensitive. He was barely more than a boy, and he did grow up with all of these prejudices. Please, Rand, may I call you Rand? He nodded slowly. I'm not going to gentle you. Taija paused to think. Actually, what exactly is gentling? Rand's disbelieving laugh was better than the horrified terror it replaced, but Taija was starting to think the poor boy needed a friend, if nothing else. Maybe she could get him hanging out with Alexei. He was just as far from home as Rand was, and didn't even have the benefit of his friends traveling with him. Taija gave Rand a reassuring smile and sat down on the wooden floor, folding her legs demurely under her bloody dress. She'd rather sit cross-legged. Here, sit down and let's talk. She smiled up at him and patted the ground beside her until he reluctantly took his own seat. Moiraine sat, exhausted, in the high-backed chair in front of the ornate desk that graced her room. She felt like she had aged a decade in the last few weeks. First the precipitous run through the ways, then the eye of the world and the horror of being confronted with nightmares straight out of myth. Being casually brushed aside by Ajna, and finally the broken seal to the Dark One's prison. On one level she should have been delighted. They had foiled the shadow. Not only had Shinar, and perhaps the world, been saved, 2 members of the Forsaken were dead, and she was also reaching the culmination of her life's journey. The dragon reborn had been found, and she was ready to guide him to Tarman Gaidan. And yet, this Taija, she wasn't going to call her Sedai in the safety of her own head. Was that woman so arrogant that she thought everyone around her was an idiot? Or was she simply so powerful that she did not care? Moiraine was not sure. It had all started to go wrong when she returned to Fal Dara with the Horn of Valor, and Lord Ajma had excitedly told her about Taija appearing from nowhere and fighting alongside the Sheenarans to defeat the Shadow Spawn. A woman of incredible power, and joining the battle at such a fortuitous moment. She had even felt a hint of censorship in his tone, poking through the deference to her status as an Aes Sedai, as he wondered why she had not been there helping the Sheenarans too. Women impersonating Aes Sedai were rare, of course. Anyone with any sense knew that the White Tower would exact its revenge when it inevitably caught them, but they did appear occasionally. Women claiming to be Aes Sedai, who could wield the one power with great strength on the other hand, were much rarer. Still, before she actually met Taija, she had had to admit she had been away from the tower for a good while, and it was not unheard of for Aes Sedai to travel under false names. She did it herself often enough. However, the woman's story had clearly been a lie. She had claimed to be Red Adger, and yet also had a warder, and regardless, there was no way she would not have been aware of a sister of significant power who was so newly raised as to not yet have the ageless face. For what must be the 100th time, Moiraine's mind went back to that first meeting with Taija. A sweet, innocent, almost deferential, and certainly not ageless face, perhaps Murandian in appearance, crowned by black hair tied back with a simple cord. Pretty, young, and utterly lacking in any of the fashion or sophistication that Moiraine would expect from a sister. The only thing that matched was the red dress she wore. Moiraine suspected Lord Aegema had provided that. When she had first seen Taija, Moiraine had thought it was clear that she was impersonating an Aes Sedai. She had had no doubt the tower would have its due when the time came, but she had decided she was not going to get involved at that point given the Sheenaran's gratitude to this Taija. One could say she had earned a measure of forbearance, and Moiraine had had other priorities. That had all changed when Taija opened her mouth. She spoke the common tongue oddly, sometimes having to think about words, sometimes choosing ones that did not quite fit. However, it was her accent that had given Moiraine one of the biggest shocks of her life. She had never heard one like it before, except once, gloating at her at the eye of the world. The soft voice of the young woman was not the same as the harsh, grating tones of Agena, but she could not deny the similarity in the way they clipped words short, made everything sound like it should have more consonants. That had been bad enough, but it was when Taija noticed Rand that Moiraine truly began to be afraid. The woman clearly knew who he was, and at that point Moiraine realized that the worst enemies were not necessarily those that simply attacked with overwhelming force. Since then, Moiraine had felt like she had been living in a terror-fueled fugue. Even with her Angreal, after Agena, she was under no illusion that she could fight one of them. She was simply too weak. For now, Taija was doing no visible harm, so Moiraine would in turn pretend to be unaware. But she knew that at any moment that woman might decide that now was the time to strike. She could no doubt kill Moiraine with casual ease and then move on with her plans for Rand. Conversations with Taija were of little help to Moiraine. That first conversation, once she'd steeled herself enough to be able to stay in a room with that woman, without wanting to either throw every ounce of power she had at her or run away as fast as she could, had been illuminating. It seemed that Taija had little awareness of what had gone in the world during her imprisonment. When she fled that first time, Moiraine half thought it might be the first genuine behavior she had seen from the woman. Of course, Taija might just be lying about her ignorance, but Moiraine did not think so. Nothing was really known about the Forsaken's imprisonment, and she saw no reason why it could not have affected different individuals differently. Agena and Balthamel had clearly been damaged in different ways, so it seemed perfectly plausible that one or more of them might have been released without realizing what had happened to the world since the breaking. When they talked more, Moiraine told her harmless things about the world, little that she could use in the here and now, and in return learnt all too little about Taija. She could only assume that anything she did say was as much of a lie as some of her other ridiculous stories. What she'd initially said about her imprisonment rang true, though: a battle, male channelers, and then nothing for 3,000 years. Of course, she had ruined it later with her ridiculous story about being discovered by a farmer who was now her warder. Presumably, she realized how suspicious it sounded. Having to hide her concern, her fear, and even revulsion was bad enough. Worse was when Taija started trying to talk to Rand. Of course, she would be seeking out the dragon reborn. Clearly, she did not plan to kill him. That would have been far too easy under the circumstances, so she must have some other goal. Perhaps to turn him. Surely having the dragon reborn turn to the shadow would be an even greater victory than achieving his death. Moiraine would do anything to prevent that from happening, though, even if she had to kill Rand herself. So far, Moiraine's efforts to keep them apart had been successful, but she feared that that could not last forever. Perhaps, just perhaps, if it could last until the Amulin arrived, then something could be done, though. It was with these thoughts running through Moiraine's head that she was interrupted by Lan bursting into her room, the door slamming into the wall with a bang. The outraged squawk of a serving woman pursuing him was ignored as he gasped to Moiraine. Up the tower. She was there together. Nothing I could do. Moiraine did not hesitate. There was no time for that. Ignoring her headache, her tiredness, she sprang to her feet, embracing Sedar through her angriel, and headed towards the tower. She did not run. That would have raised too many questions among the Sheenarans, but she certainly walked faster than would strictly be polite, barely acknowledging the greetings of those she passed, at least those that weren't so intimidated by the grim set of her face that they flattened themselves against the wall to let her by. As Moiraine made her way to the tower, she went back to replaying another debate in her head. Which one was she? There was so little information to work with. Messana. She had mentioned being a scholar, if that was not another lie. Probably not Greendal or Semirage. From what little she knew, they simply did not fit. Magedian, maybe. Could it be Lanfear? She was said to have had a fixation with Luz Thurin Telemon. It was with these thoughts going through her head that she pulled herself up the ladder to the top of the tower. Reaching the top, she wove air and blasted open the trapdoor immediately before she lifted herself above the floor level. She hadn't been sure what she would see, but it wasn't Taija and Rand casually sitting on the floor, a perfectly respectable distance apart, she idly noted, both looking towards her with shocked faces. It was enough to make her pause, and then Rand smiled for what might be the first time she'd seen since the Eye of the World and called out, "Moiraine said, you won't believe what Taija's told me. It's incredible. Please, join us." Moiraine sighed and slowly pulled herself through the hatch to be followed by Lan to go and sit down, although she kept hold of Sedar. What on earth was she going to do now? Taija stared at Moiraine as she joined them, the golden aura of someone holding Sedar bright around her. She must have an angriel. She was holding enough of the power to match Taija's own limits, and she knew Moiraine wasn't that strong. For once, Moiraine's always controlled face had lost its composure, and she looked unsure whether she should be furious or in tears. Taija wondered whether this was because she'd been talking to Rand. Was Moiraine the one that kept stopping that from happening? If so, she really couldn't work out why. Perhaps it was something to do with Sedin. Rand had certainly seemed worried about that. Either way, Taija felt like the situation was close to getting out of control and someone needed to be the grown-up. So she forced a smile. "Welcome, Moiraine. It's good to see you. We've been having a lovely chat, and it'll be nice to have you join us." Even ignoring Moiraine's odd entrance, Taija was a bit irritated with her. The poor boy had been terrified when she first spoke to him, and it felt like at least part of that was from the way Moiraine had been ignoring him since Tarwin's Gap. Taija still wasn't sure what Moiraine had been doing while she was at the battle. Rand had seemed particularly reluctant to talk about it, so she hadn't pressed him, but clearly something was going on. Regardless, Taija thought a lot of what he needed to get him out of his funk, at least temporarily, was just a sympathetic ear and some chatting about life. She wasn't sure Rand really believed some of her stories about the Age of Legends, or even that she really was an Aes Sedai, but her willingness to listen to him without criticism seemed to work to reassure and eventually relax him.